Behind the silent walls of Alamut, a small community discovered how fear, faith, and strategy could challenge entire medieval empires. Tonight, we'll uncover the true story of the assassins, separating historical evidence from the legends of secret gardens and drugged killers. Welcome to Sleepy Hidden History. Before we begin, tell me which city you're listening from tonight. And please like and subscribe. Those small actions mean more to me than you know. Thank you so much. Long before European travelers whispered of the assassins, before the name Alamut became tangled with stories of hidden gardens and fearless killers, the Islamic world of the 11th century was already coming apart along lines that were political, religious, ethnic, and deeply personal. From a distance, it could still look like a single civilization stretching from North Africa to Central Asia, joined by trade routes, scholarship, pilgrimage, and the Arabic language of faith. But beneath that broad surface, authority had fractured. Caliphs claimed universal leadership, while generals controlled armies, viziers managed governments, regional dynasties guarded their own interests, and rival religious traditions offered competing answers to the same dangerous question: who had the right to lead the Muslim community? In Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliph still occupied the most prestigious throne in Sunni Islam, yet by the mid-11th century his political power had narrowed. The city remained a center of memory, law, and legitimacy. But the caliph could no longer command the vast territories once ruled by his ancestors. Real military strength increasingly belonged to newcomers from the east, the Seljuk Turks, whose mounted armies had moved across Iran and into Iraq. In 1055, the Seljuk leader Tughril Beg entered Baghdad and presented himself not as a destroyer of the Abbasid order, but as its protector. It was a brilliant arrangement. The Abbasid Caliph preserved sacred prestige, while the Seljuk Sultan exercised practical power. Yet such partnerships are rarely as stable as they appear. One man possessed the title, another controlled the soldiers, and between them stood court officials, jurists, commanders, and ambitious relatives, each capable of turning a disagreement into a crisis. The Seljuk Empire itself was not a single machine directed smoothly from one capital. It was a web of princes, military households, provincial governors, and land grants, held together by loyalty, family ties, negotiation, and force. The great vizier Nizam al-Mulk worked for decades to impose order on this restless structure. He supported institutions, appointed officials, balanced rival factions, and helped turn Seljuk conquest into government. But the very scale of his task reveals the weakness beneath the empire's confidence. A ruler could win a province in a season and lose it when he died. A governor could become nearly independent. A prince denied his expected inheritance could raise an army against his own brother. The empire looked immense on a map, but power was scattered among individuals, and when power depends on individuals, the removal of one person can change everything. That fact would later become central to the strategy associated with the assassins. But the conditions that made such a strategy effective were already present. To the west, another caliphate challenged the Abbasids not merely for territory, but for the meaning of legitimate rule. The Fatimids had founded their state in North Africa in 909 and conquered Egypt in 969, establishing Cairo as the center of an Ismaili Shii empire. Their rulers claimed descent through Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, and Ali, his cousin and son-in-law. To their followers, the Fatimid Caliph was also the living Imam, the divinely guided heir in a continuing line of spiritual authority. This was more than a competing dynasty, it was a rival vision of history. The Abbasids in Baghdad and the Fatimids in Cairo each presented themselves as the rightful center of the Muslim world, and their struggle traveled far beyond armies and borders. It moved through sermons, letters, schools, merchants, missionaries, and private conversations held behind closed doors. To understand why the future Nizari movement inspired such fear, it is necessary to understand this quieter contest over belief. Shi'i traditions had emerged from disputes concerning leadership after the death of the Prophet, especially the conviction that authority properly belonged within his family through Ali. Over time, Shi'i communities developed along several lines, often because of disagreement over which descendant should be recognized as imam. The Ismailis traced the continuing imamate through Ismail, the son of Ja'afar al-Sadiq, and eventually recognized the Fatimid rulers as the public imams of their age. For believers living under hostile or suspicious governments, allegiance to an imam was not simply a private theological preference. It could be interpreted as loyalty to a rival sovereign. A prayer, a meeting, or the arrival of a teacher might therefore appear to officials as the first step toward rebellion. This atmosphere encouraged secrecy, but secrecy did not automatically mean conspiracy. Ismaili missionaries, known as da'is, taught, debated, organized communities, and invited listeners into a structured understanding of faith. Their success varied greatly, and many hostile descriptions of their methods were written by opponents who had strong reasons to portray them as deceivers. What can be said with greater confidence is that Ismaili networks reached into regions far from Cairo, including Yemen, Syria, Central Asia, and the Iranian world, where old local identities and resentment toward outside rule created fertile ground for alternatives. Persia under Seljuk control was especially complex. The Seljuks were Sunni rulers of Turkic origin, governing lands with deep Persian administrative traditions and populations that included many schools of law, theology, philosophy, and Shi'i belief. Persian officials helped run the empire, Persian culture shaped its courts, and local mountain communities often remained difficult to control. The result was not a simple conflict between Turks and Persians, or Sunnis and Shi'is, but a layered struggle in which social position, taxation, geography, family rivalry, and religious conviction could overlap. Some people may have turned toward Ismailism from sincere spiritual belief. Others may also have seen its organization as a form of resistance to Seljuk authority. Usually, the motives cannot be separated cleanly. Medieval people were no less complicated than modern ones, and faith and politics rarely occupied different rooms. Meanwhile, the Fatimid state that inspired Ismaili loyalty was itself entering a dangerous period. The long reign of Al-Mustansir, which began in 1036, had once represented extraordinary reach and prestige. But Egypt later suffered severe internal conflict, economic disruption, hunger, and struggles among military factions. Cairo did not collapse, yet the crisis exposed how vulnerable even a sacred monarchy could become when food systems failed and armed groups competed for control. Stability was restored in large part by Badr al-Jamali, a powerful military commander who arrived from Syria and became vizier in 1074. His success strengthened the government, but it also concentrated enormous authority in the hands of the vizier. Once again, the same pattern appeared. An exalted ruler remained at the center of the political universe, while another man increasingly controlled the mechanisms that made rule possible. In those years, a Persian convert and missionary named Hasan-i Sabbah traveled through this divided world. Later legends would turn him into an almost supernatural mastermind, but the historical figure emerged from recognizable circumstances. He lived at a time when intellectual arguments could carry political consequences, when rival caliphates competed for allegiance, and when the Seljuk order seemed powerful yet uneven. Hasan joined the Ismaili mission and eventually traveled to Cairo, probably arriving in 1078. What he witnessed there is difficult to reconstruct in detail, and later accounts cannot always be trusted. But he encountered a Fatimid capital recently pulled back from disaster, and a court in which the question of succession was becoming increasingly dangerous. Al-Mustansir had ruled for decades and had several sons. When such a ruler dies, the transfer of power is never only a family matter. It determines who controls the court, who commands the army, who retains office, and, for Ismailis, who is recognized as the next imam. Later Nizari tradition maintained that the eldest son, Nizar, had been designated to succeed his father. Other evidence complicates that certainty, and historians continue to examine competing reports. What is beyond dispute is that when Al-Mustansir died in 1094, the succession did not produce unity. The powerful vizier Al-Afdal, son of Badr al-Jamali, supported a younger son, Al-Mustali, who was quickly placed on the throne. Nizar rejected the decision, fled to Alexandria, raised a revolt, and was defeated and killed. The Ismaili community split. Many in Egypt, Yemen, and Western India accepted al-Mustali, while Hassan and the Persian Ismailis upheld Nizar's claim and severed their ties with Cairo. Yet by the time this rupture became official, Hassan had already made the move that changed the story. 4 years earlier, in 1090, he had gained control of a remote fortress in the Alborz Mountains called Alamut. He had not chosen it because it was beautiful, though from its heights the valleys must have seemed to fold endlessly into the distance. He chose it because fractured worlds reward those who understand geography. Armies ruled the plains, courts ruled the capitals, but mountains could shelter a different kind of power. As Baghdad defended an old legitimacy, Cairo struggled over a sacred succession, and Seljuk princes competed beneath the shadow of their own empire. Hasan-i Sabbah was preparing a center that answered to none of them. The assassins had not yet entered history under the name their enemies would give them, but the world that would fear them was already in place, divided, suspicious, and held together by a handful of men whose deaths could shake entire kingdoms. Hasan-i Sabbah enters the historical record not as the master of a secret army, but as a young man in Ray, a city where theology, trade, scholarship, and political rumor moved through the same crowded streets. Born in Qom sometime in the 1050s, probably into a Twelver Shi'i family, he grew up close enough to Seljuk power to feel its pressure, and among ideas official institutions did not always welcome. The surviving accounts of Hassan's youth are incomplete. A biography known as The Life of Our Master may have preserved material from his own recollections, but the work disappeared and is known only through later historians, several of whom wrote after the Mongol destruction of Alamut and viewed the Nizaris with hostility. That loss matters because nearly every portrait of Hassan has been painted through a cracked window. His enemies remembered a cold fanatic, later followers saw a disciplined guardian of the Imam, and European storytellers transformed him into the Old Man of the Mountain, a title more closely associated with a later Syrian leader. Between those images stands a historical man whose greatest weapon was not mystery, but patience. One famous tale claims that Hassan studied beside the poet and mathematician Omar Khayyam and the future Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk, and that the three promised to share their fortunes if any one of them rose to power. It is a perfect story, the poet, the statesman, and the revolutionary beginning as friends before history drives them apart. It is also almost certainly a legend created long after their deaths. Their ages and careers do not fit the tale comfortably, and no reliable contemporary evidence places them together. Yet the story endured because it makes a complicated age feel personal, as though the conflict to come had already been written into their youth. The real beginning was quieter. In Ray, Hassan encountered Ismaili missionaries who argued that reason alone could not settle every religious dispute, and that believers required authoritative guidance from a divinely appointed imam. At first, according to later reports, Hassan resisted. He had been raised in another Shi'i tradition, and conversion meant more than accepting a new interpretation of doctrine. It meant loyalty to the Fatimid Caliph Imam in Cairo, whom the Seljuk order regarded as a dangerous rival. But Hassan listened, questioned, and gradually became convinced. At roughly 17, he took an oath of allegiance to al-Mustansir. The decision was private in form, but revolutionary in consequence. He had entered a network that crossed borders without possessing a conventional army, carried teachings through trusted human relationships, and survived because its members understood when to speak and when silence was safer. Hassan's talents were recognized early. In 1072, the senior Persian missionary Abd al-Malik ibn Attash reportedly gave him a formal position within the Ismaili mission, and Hassan later spent time in Isfahan, the covert center of its activities in Seljuk territory. He was not yet building castles or issuing commands. He was learning how communities formed, how messages traveled, and how belief could unite people separated by mountains and hostile governments. Those skills are less dramatic than the dagger of legend, but without them, there would have been no Alamut. Such a movement depends on discipline, trust, and a painful awareness of human weakness. One careless recruit can expose an entire circle. Hassan appears to have understood organization as architecture, with each person placed like a stone whose strength depended on those around it. In 1076 or 1077, he was sent west to continue his education in the Fatimid world. He reached Cairo in 1078, entering what must have seemed the visible center of his faith: monumental gates, royal ceremony, libraries, scholars, officials, and a living imam behind layers of protocol. Yet Cairo was not the serene heart of a unified movement. The caliphate had recently survived famine and military disorder, while real power shifted toward the formidable vizier Badr al-Jamali. Hassan remained in Egypt for about 3 years, spending time in Cairo and Alexandria, but the details are shadowy. Later Nizari accounts say he clashed with Badr and supported al-Mustansir's son Nizar as the rightful successor. That interpretation fits the later split, but historians cannot be certain that the succession dispute had already taken the exact form later writers gave it. His conflict with the vizier may have involved the missionary hierarchy, court factions, or Badr's concentration of power. What seems clearer is that Hassan did not become a comfortable servant of Cairo. He was expelled or compelled to leave, and in 1081 he returned to Persia carrying education, disappointment, and perhaps a sharper understanding of the distance between sacred legitimacy and political control. The return did not lead him immediately to open rebellion. For several years he traveled across Persia in service of the Ismaili mission, observing regions rather than merely passing through them. He moved through areas where Seljuk rule was strong and others where it thinned, studying roads, loyalties, and defensive terrain. Later historians describe him evaluating Seljuk military strength, and his movements reveal a strategic mind changing its scale of thought. A missionary normally seeks people. Hassan increasingly sought places capable of protecting those people. He had grasped a brutal fact. An exposed community could be scattered whenever a governor chose to act, while a fortified community could force an empire to spend soldiers, money, and time simply to reach it. He turned toward Dalam and the Alborz Mountains south of the Caspian Sea, a region of strong Shi'i traditions and rugged valleys. Here, geography could reverse the balance of power. A small group on an open plain was vulnerable. Behind steep approaches, stored grain, reliable water, and high walls, it could become too costly to remove. Hassan's choice of the mountains is sometimes presented as the instinct of a fugitive seeking somewhere to hide, but it was more ambitious than concealment. He was searching for a base from which a scattered network could become an independent political order. His method also reveals why the later image of a wild-eyed cult leader is misleading. Hassan did not rush at the Seljuks with a doomed army. He spent years cultivating contacts and weakening resistance before revealing his intention. By around 1087, his attention had fixed on one fortress in particular, Alamut, rising above the Rudbar Valley. The name has often been associated with an eagle's nest, though its precise origin remains uncertain. What mattered was the position. Alamut commanded a difficult landscape and stood beyond the easy reach of central authority. Hassan's followers began working in the villages around it and, according to the traditional narrative, inside the fortress itself. Conversion preceded conquest. Loyalty changed quietly, person by person, until the owner of the stronghold, a local lord often identified as Mahdi, discovered that the walls still belonged to him in law, but many of the people within them no longer did in spirit. The takeover in 1090 appears to have occurred with little fighting. Some sources say Hassan compensated the former owner with a draft for 3,000 gold dinars, a detail that may contain truth but also carries the shape of legend. The deeper point is harder to dismiss. Hassan captured one of the most formidable fortresses in Persia not by breaking its gates, but by changing the allegiance behind them. This was his political signature. He preferred preparation to spectacle and understood that power often changes hands before the public notices. Once inside Alamut, he did something later storytellers rarely found exciting enough to emphasize. He stayed. Tradition claims he never descended during the remaining 34 years of his life, spending his time reading, writing, judging, and administering a growing state. That claim may have been sharpened to express his severity, but even hostile sources remembered an existence of extreme discipline. Reports say he imposed strict religious conduct, lived without courtly luxury, and punished members of his own family with a harshness later generations found both impressive and unsettling. Stories that he ordered the deaths of 2 sons come through later Persian historians and require caution, especially because one accusation was reportedly later shown to be false. Still, they helped create the picture of a leader determined to place his cause above personal ties. Hassan inspired obedience because he seemed unnervingly consistent, a man who had reduced his life to a single purpose and expected those around him to do the same. Yet no individual, however disciplined, builds a state alone. He depended on missionaries, farmers, engineers, scribes, commanders, and families willing to endure isolation and siege. His genius lay in making their separate risks feel like parts of one design. By the time al-Mustansir died in 1094, and the Ismaili succession fractured around the claims of Nizar and al-Musta'li, Hassan was no longer waiting for instructions from Egypt. He supported Nizar, severed relations with Cairo, and emerged as the leader of an independent Nizari mission whose imam was no longer publicly accessible. This could have destroyed the movement by leaving it without a visible center. Instead, Hassan made Alamut that center, not a replacement for the imam, but the headquarters of a community waiting, organizing, and surviving in his name. The man behind the legend had begun as a convert in a crowded Persian city and become the architect of a state hidden among mountains. He had not yet terrified medieval empires, but he had discovered the principle that would allow him to challenge them. When a powerful enemy controls the roads, the armies, and the capitals, survival begins by choosing ground where its strength becomes a burden. At first light, Alamut did not resemble the center of a future state. It appeared instead as a dark spine of rock suspended above the Rudbar Valley, its walls rising where the mountain itself seemed to narrow into the sky. Nearly 2,000 meters above sea level, the fortress occupied a long, steep crest in the central Alborz range, northeast of Qazvin, approached through terrain that forced travelers into confined valleys and difficult mountain paths. An army could reach the region, but reaching the region was not the same as taking the castle. Men, animals, siege equipment, and food all had to move through a landscape that resisted them at every turn. The final approach was so restricted that numbers could lose their usual meaning. On an open plain, 10,000 soldiers might overwhelm a few hundred defenders. On a narrow slope beneath fortified heights, those same soldiers could become a slow and hungry column waiting for winter. This was the first secret of Alamut, and it required no hidden ritual to understand. Geography had already done most of the work. The fortress was not built by Hasan-i Sabbah. Tradition dates its construction to around 860, when a ruler of the local Yustanid dynasty selected the site in the mountains of Dalam. A popular explanation claims that an eagle revealed the location to him, leading later writers to interpret the name Alamut as something like the eagle's teaching or the place taught by the eagle. It is an irresistible image, a ruler watching a bird settle upon an inaccessible rock and realizing that nature had drawn the outline of a fortress. But the exact origin of the name remains uncertain. What matters is that long before Hasan arrived, local rulers understood the defensive power of the place. The region had traditions of political independence and strong Shi'i influence, and control from distant capitals was often more theoretical than complete. Mountain communities could acknowledge an empire when necessary, pay what they could not avoid, and still preserve habits, loyalties, and rivalries that officials on the plains never fully mastered. Alamut, therefore, stood within a living landscape, not above an empty wilderness. Villages, orchards, fields, streams, and paths surrounded it. Whoever controlled the fortress also had to understand the valley below, because stone walls could resist an assault, but they could not feed themselves. Hasan's most important work began after the gates belonged to him. The romantic version of a mountain citadel focuses on its height, as though height alone made it invincible. In reality, every fortress contains a hidden clock. Food disappears, water falls, timber burns, animals weaken, illness spreads. If defenders cannot replace what they consume, the strongest walls merely postpone surrender. Hasan attacked this problem with the same patience he had used to gain the stronghold. Cultivation in the valley was improved, irrigation systems were developed, and the surrounding land was organized to support a community that expected to face isolation. Water had to be collected, redirected, protected from contamination, and stored through dry periods. Across the Ismaili strongholds of Rudbar, engineers relied on cisterns, canals, and underground channels to make prolonged resistance possible. Grain and other provisions could be kept inside fortified spaces, turning time from the besieger's weapon into the defender's ally. A Seljuk commander might arrive expecting a quick victory, only to discover that the people above him had prepared not for weeks, but potentially for seasons. Then the weather would change, roads would become harder, supply animals would die or be driven away, soldiers would grow restless, rival princes elsewhere would begin moving. Every day spent beneath Alamut carried a political cost far beyond the valley. The castle's strength, therefore, did not lie in being completely unreachable. No inhabited place truly is. Its strength lay in making conquest more expensive than an enemy's patience. Hasan also understood that self-sufficiency was partly psychological. A community expecting rescue remains dependent on the outside world. A community trained to believe it can endure begins to behave like a state. Behind Alamut's defenses lived more than armed guards. There were administrators keeping records, laborers maintaining structures, craftsmen repairing tools, religious teachers instructing followers, messengers carrying orders, and families whose daily routines continued beneath the threat of attack. Larger Nizari castles could function almost as fortified towns, serving simultaneously as military posts, seats of local government, centers of learning, and bases for missionaries traveling into other regions. That fuller image is easy to lose because later legend reduced Alamut to a secret school for killers. Such a school makes a vivid story, but it cannot explain how the stronghold survived decade after decade. Fear may remove an enemy. Only administration can preserve a society. Within the walls, authority had to be visible and predictable. Stores had to be counted. Disputes had to be judged. Fields had to be protected. Messages had to arrive without revealing the entire network to anyone who intercepted them. Hasan's discipline, which could appear severe even to those who admired him, was inseparable from this environment. A court on a fertile plain could survive some waste, corruption, or disorder because wealth continued to flow toward it. Alamut possessed no such luxury. Carelessness could become hunger, and divided loyalty could open a gate. The fortress demanded a culture in which personal behavior carried public consequences. Yet Hasan did not imagine Alamut merely as a bunker waiting for enemies. He established a library there, beginning a collection that later included manuscripts, documents, and scientific instruments. This detail changes the atmosphere of the castle. In one chamber, guards may have watched the paths below. In another, scholars and scribes worked over texts by lamplight. Religious interpretation, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, law, and political intelligence could all matter to a leadership trying to understand both the heavens and the movements of armies. The precise size and contents of the early library cannot be reconstructed with confidence, especially because much of Alamut's written heritage was lost when the Mongols reached the fortress in the 13th century. Even so, later accounts make clear that the collection became substantial enough to impress those who entered after its surrender. The library was not an ornamental addition. It belonged to the same strategy as the cistern and the granary. Water allowed bodies to endure, food allowed the community to remain, and knowledge allowed the state to think beyond the next siege. This combination made Alamut far more dangerous to its enemies than a simple rebel hideout. A band of fugitives can be hunted. A fortified intellectual and administrative center can reproduce itself, train representatives, preserve doctrine, issue instructions, and coordinate distant communities. From the heights of Alamut, Hasan could not see every settlement connected to his mission, but information could flow toward him through trusted routes. Reports from towns and provinces could be compared. Local grievances could be recognized. Opportunities could be evaluated before action was taken. The fortress became a place where scattered dissatisfaction was transformed into organized purpose. This did not create perfect control. Medieval communication remained slow, uncertain, and vulnerable to betrayal. Local leaders still had to improvise, and messages could arrive after circumstances had already changed. But Alamut provided something the Persian Ismailis had previously lacked: a fixed center that could survive the arrest of a missionary or the collapse of a cell in a distant city. If one branch was exposed, the root remained protected in the mountains. The symbolism of the fortress strengthened that reality. For followers living under hostile rule, Alamut proved that resistance was no longer an idea whispered in private homes. It possessed walls, fields, laws, and a physical horizon. For Seljuk authorities, the same fortress represented an intolerable challenge. Rebellion was familiar. Ambitious governors and rival princes rebelled constantly. Alamut was different because its leadership did not seek recognition from the Seljuk political order. Hasan was not bargaining for a governorship or asking to be admitted into the court. His community claimed a source of authority outside the Sunni institutions supported by the Sultan. The fortress, therefore, threatened not only territory, but the assumption that Seljuk power defined the limits of legitimate public life, and yet its actual territory remained small. This contrast between limited physical size and enormous political meaning helps explain why Alamut inspired such intense hostility. On a map, it was a point in the mountains. In the imagination of its enemies, it was evidence that the empire could be defied from within its own borders. Campaigns were sent into the region, villages were pressured, crops could be targeted, and surrounding communities were forced to calculate the price of supporting Hasan. The struggle was never confined to the castle walls. It moved through the valley's economy and through the uncertain loyalties of people who might fear both the imperial army below and the new authority above. Some supported the Nizaris from conviction. Others may have chosen whichever side seemed most likely to survive. In such conditions, neutrality becomes difficult, and history rarely records the reasoning of ordinary families caught between larger powers. Alamut's survival depended partly on persuading those families that the fortress was not a passing occupation, but a permanent presence. Each failed attempt to remove it strengthened that belief. The longer Hasan remained, the more yesterday's rebellion became today's government. From the walls, the world below must sometimes have seemed distant, but Alamut was never truly isolated from it. Every caravan delayed by conflict, every change at the Seljuk court, every death of a governor, and every dispute between princes could alter the pressure on the valley. Hasan's achievement was to make the fortress responsive without making it exposed. It could receive information while limiting access, influence events while refusing open battle, and project authority far beyond the range of its own defenders. Later generations would cover the mountain with stories of secret gardens, intoxicating visions, and men trained to die without fear. Those tales would become more famous than the channels carrying water through stone or the officials measuring grain in storage rooms. But the ordinary mechanisms were the true wonder. Alamut endured because someone had calculated how people might eat during a siege, how books might be preserved, how orders might travel, and how a narrow mountain valley could be turned into the center of a state. The Eagle's fortress was not powerful because it floated beyond the reach of history. It was powerful because Hasan-i Sabbah understood history's practical foundations more clearly than many rulers with larger armies. Walls could protect a movement, but only a network could expand it, and while Alamut grew stronger above the valley, Hasan's followers were already searching the mountains of Persia for other heights from which an empire might be forced to look upward. From the heights of Alamut, Hasan-i Sabbah could command a valley, but a single valley would never be enough. The Seljuk realm stretched across immense distances, linking cities, plains, mountain passes, and provinces that could each provide another army when one had been defeated. If Hasan allowed his movement to remain concentrated around one fortress, the sultans would eventually surround it, seal its roads, destroy the supporting villages, and wait for isolation to finish what their soldiers could not. His answer was not to conquer outward in the ordinary way. There would be no continuous frontier advancing mile by mile, no capital surrounded by a widening circle of obedient provinces, and no great army carrying banners across an open battlefield. Instead, a different kind of state began to emerge, scattered across Persia like points of fire separated by hundreds of miles of enemy territory. Each point might consist of a fortress, several villages, a mountain district, or a community hidden within a hostile town. Together they formed something medieval rulers found difficult to understand and even harder to destroy: an empire without a single body. Its first expansion unfolded through the rugged district of Rudbar surrounding Alamut. Hasan's missionaries moved among settlements, gained supporters, identified defensible heights, and negotiated with local figures whose loyalty to the Seljuks was often shallow or forced. Some strongholds were converted from within, some were purchased, some were newly built, and others were seized during moments when nearby authorities were distracted. The methods varied because Hasan was not following one rigid plan. He was studying the weakness of each location and using the least costly route to control it. A fortress gained without a battle preserved defenders, supplies, and walls. A village persuaded rather than punished was more likely to provide food during the next siege. This was conquest through allegiance, as much as territory, and it allowed the Nizaris to expand without possessing the resources of a conventional empire. The most important addition in Rudbar was Lamasar, a vast fortress west of Alamut, overlooking routes through the Sharut Valley. Where Alamut served as the spiritual and administrative heart, Lamasar became a shield guarding the western approaches. Its natural slopes were difficult to climb, while its extensive water system included channels and numerous cisterns cut into the rock. Archaeological study suggests it could sustain hundreds of defenders and their animals through long periods of pressure. The stronghold was placed under Kia Buzurg Umid, one of Hasan's most capable lieutenants, who strengthened its walls and transformed it into a major regional center. The choice revealed a crucial feature of the emerging state. Hasan did not attempt to manage every distant gate, field, and garrison personally. He selected trusted leaders, gave them responsibility, and connected their local authority to the larger mission centered on Alamut. Lamasar could therefore respond quickly to threats in its own valley while remaining part of a coordinated system. It protected Alamut, but it was not merely an outpost waiting for instructions, it was a functioning center of power in its own right. Rudbar eventually contained dozens of forts and fortified positions, some commanding river crossings, others watching mountain roads or protecting productive land. No single fortress had to perform every task. One could observe a pass, another store supplies, and another shelter nearby communities when an army appeared. The network made invasion more complicated because taking one castle did not open the entire region. An attacker could spend months capturing a position only to find that messages, leadership, and resistance had shifted elsewhere. The state behaved less like a wall that could be breached than a chain whose surviving links continued to hold. Encyclopedia Iranica identifies Rudbar, Kumis, Kuhistan, and later Syria as the principal semi-autonomous regions of the wider Nizari state, with Alamut and Lamasar dominating the first, and Gerdku standing among the strongest fortresses of Kumis. The most astonishing expansion, however, occurred far to the east in Kuhistan, a dry, mountainous region south of Khorasan. In 1091, Hasan sent the missionary Hussein Kaini into his native province to organize local support. Kuhistan lay far beyond the mountains of Alamut, separated from Rudbar by cities and territories controlled by Seljuk officials. By ordinary political logic, it should have been impossible for the two regions to form one state. Yet ordinary political logic assumed that rulers needed uninterrupted roads and borders to maintain authority. The Nizari mission already possessed something different: communities linked by shared belief, trusted representatives, and a structure capable of functioning underground before it became visible. In Kuhistan, resentment toward Seljuk administration appears to have combined with existing Ismaili support and the movement rapidly took on the character of a regional uprising. Several towns and strongholds passed into Nizari hands. Within roughly 2 years of Alamut's capture, Hasan's followers controlled meaningful territory in 2 widely separated regions, creating an independent state inside the Seljuk world without ever joining its pieces together. Life in Kuhistan did not simply mirror life at Alamut. Distance made that impossible. Local leaders had to manage relations with neighboring rulers, oversee settlements, organize defense, and judge when to negotiate or resist. These regional chiefs, sometimes known as muhtashams, could exercise significant initiative while recognizing the authority of Alamut. This balance between unity and independence was one of the system's greatest strengths. Orders and doctrine could travel from the center, but local survival depended on people who understood their own terrain. A message written in Alamut could not predict every change occurring weeks away in eastern Persia. By the time a courier arrived, an enemy commander might have moved, a harvest might have failed, or an alliance might have collapsed. The network survived because it was coordinated without being mechanically controlled. It had a center, but not every heartbeat depended on the center's immediate command. Between Rudbar and Kuhistan stood Kumis, the region around Damgan and Shemnan, where the fortress of Gerdku rose from an isolated mountain near important routes crossing northern Iran. Gerdku would become one of the most enduring Nizari strongholds, surviving enemies who destroyed far more famous castles. Its location allowed its defenders to observe movement across the surrounding country and placed another protected station between the eastern and western zones. Yet even this did not create a continuous corridor. Travelers and messengers still crossed lands governed by others. They moved through marketplaces, caravan routes, villages, and mountain paths where discovery could expose not just one person, but everyone connected to him. Communication therefore depended upon secrecy, memory, personal trust, and careful separation of knowledge. A messenger did not need to know the entire structure. A local supporter might know the next safe house, but not the destination beyond it. This was not the machinery of a modern intelligence service, despite how later legends sometimes describe it. It was a fragile human system in which weather, fear, bribery, illness, or betrayal could break a connection. Its achievement lay not in perfection, but in continuing to function despite those weaknesses. Seljuk fragmentation gave the Nizaris room to grow. After the deaths of Sultan Malik Shah and Nizam al-Mulk in 1092, rival princes fought over succession, armies shifted allegiance, and provincial rulers watched the court before committing themselves to any campaign. The crisis did not make the Seljuks powerless, but it divided their attention. Hasan understood that a large empire could be strongest in resources while weakest in focus. When several princes needed the same soldiers, and every commander feared what might happen elsewhere during his absence, a distant mountain rebellion became difficult to crush decisively. The Nizaris exploited these intervals to improve defenses, recruit supporters, and acquire additional positions. In some places, they moved dangerously close to the political center. The most dramatic example was Shahdiz, a great fortress overlooking Isfahan, one of the most important Seljuk capitals. Nizari control of such a position was not merely a military concern. It was a humiliation visible from the heart of imperial power. From Shahdiz, their presence could no longer be dismissed as a problem hidden in remote mountains. Yet the episode also revealed the limits of their strategy. A fortress near a major capital attracted overwhelming attention, and when Sultan Muhammad Tapar concentrated his forces against Shahdiz, the Nizari position was eventually destroyed. Its fall demonstrated that dispersion could preserve the wider movement, but it could not make every stronghold invulnerable. The loss of one castle might be survivable, the people inside it were not. The map of the Nizari state therefore changed constantly. Some territories remained under their control for generations, while others were held only briefly. Villages changed sides, isolated communities disappeared from the record, and fortresses that seemed promising became traps when local support failed. It would be misleading to picture every Nizari settlement obeying Alamut with perfect devotion. Regional disputes, personal ambitions, and practical compromises must have existed, although hostile sources rarely cared to preserve such ordinary details. Nor should every Ismaili living in these lands be imagined as a militant rebel. Most were farmers, craftsmen, traders, families, teachers, and believers attempting to live within a political struggle they had not personally designed. The survival of the state depended upon them more than it depended upon the few individuals later made famous by violence. They produced grain, maintained roads, carried information, repaired walls, and created enough normal life for extraordinary resistance to continue. What made this scattered state so unsettling was that conventional victory could not end it. If a Seljuk army captured a fort in western Persia, the community in Kihistan remained. If authorities uncovered supporters in a city, the castles of Rutbar continued to operate. If a regional leader died, another could take responsibility without recreating the entire movement from nothing. The Nizaris had turned their weakness, their small numbers and geographic separation, into a form of resilience. They did not need to dominate everything between their territories. They needed only to preserve the connections that gave those territories a common purpose. By Hasan's later years, the Persian Nizaris held important castles, towns, and villages in Rudbar, Kuhistan, and Kumis. While neither side could achieve a final victory, the Seljuks remained too powerful to overthrow, but repeated campaigns failed to uproot the mountain state. A tense balance was taking shape. The Nizaris could survive behind stone, but survival alone would not stop new armies from assembling. They needed a method capable of reaching beyond their isolated fortresses and striking at the human connections holding enemy power together. In a world where armies obeyed commanders, provinces depended on governors, and entire campaigns could collapse when one powerful man disappeared, Hasan began to treat individual lives as pressure points in the machinery of empire. And the figures chosen to approach those pressure points would soon become the most feared members of the Nizari world. The man walking toward the Seljuk camp did not look like the weapon of a mountain state. He carried no banner, commanded no cavalry, and gave no sign that the balance of power might shift with his arrival. That was precisely what made the Fidai so unsettling. The Nizaris could be watched when they stood upon the walls of Alamut, counted when they defended a fortress, and surrounded when an army entered their valleys. But beyond those walls, they became difficult to distinguish from the world around them. A traveler, servant, student, petitioner, or religious devotee might pass through the same gates as everyone else, and a powerful ruler could never be entirely certain which face belonged to an ordinary subject and which belonged to someone who had accepted a mission from the mountains. The word Fidai did not originally mean assassin in the narrow modern sense. It referred to a devotee prepared to sacrifice himself for a cause, someone whose commitment placed his own survival below the purpose he believed he served. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, the term became closely associated with Nizari volunteers sent against particular political, military, or religious enemies, generally prominent figures rather than civilian populations. The evidence suggests that such missions gradually became an organized element of Nizari strategy, but the surviving Ismaili writings from the Alamut period provide almost no reliable account of how volunteers were selected or trained. The elaborate schools of disguise, language, and secret combat described by later European storytellers belong largely to legend rather than recoverable history. What the sources do reveal is more human and, in some ways, more disturbing. These were people whose loyalty could carry them into places from which they were unlikely to return. To understand why Hasan-i Sabbah gave such individuals an important political role, one must look at the machinery of Seljuk rule. The Sultanate possessed overwhelming military resources, but those resources did not move by themselves. Armies depended on commanders, campaigns depended on governors, courts depended on viziers, and local authority often rested upon one powerful man whose household connected soldiers, money, land, and political favors. Remove a few walls from a castle and they could be rebuilt. Remove the individual holding together a coalition, however, and the entire structure might begin to loosen. Hasan recognized that Seljuk power was widely distributed but intensely personal. Rather than attempting to destroy an empire in one impossible confrontation, he could place pressure upon the people who made that empire function locality by locality. Contemporary societies had known political assassination long before the Nizaris, and neither Hasan nor his followers invented it. What distinguished their use of it was how carefully it matched their position as a small community facing opponents with far greater armies. The most famous early case occurred in October 1092, when the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk was killed while traveling with the imperial court. He had served 2 sultans and spent decades turning conquest into administration. His influence extended through appointments, military patronage, religious institutions, taxation, diplomacy, and the personal relationships that held the Seljuk elite together. He was also a determined political opponent of the Ismailis, condemning them in writing and supporting campaigns against their growing strongholds. Medieval accounts commonly identify his attacker as an Ismaili fidai, and the killing soon became inseparable from the reputation of Hasan-i Sabbah. Yet the full story is less certain than the legend suggests. Nizam al-Mulk had recently fallen into conflict with Sultan Malik Shah and faced powerful enemies inside the court, including factions that stood to benefit from his removal. Some medieval reports suspected that members of the royal household, perhaps with the Sultan's knowledge, had cooperated with the plot. The Nizaris may indeed have supplied the man who carried out the act, but the possibility of court involvement reminds us that a visible attacker does not always reveal every hidden interest behind a political death. Whatever the precise chain of responsibility, the consequences were immediate. Seljuk expeditions against the Nizari regions lost one of their most powerful organizers, and Malik Shah himself died only weeks later. There is no convincing reason to treat the Sultan's death as part of the same operation, although rumor naturally joined the two events. The empire entered a prolonged succession struggle, and Hasan gained time to consolidate his mountain territories. The lesson was impossible for both sides to miss. A single death had not defeated the Seljuks, but it had interrupted a campaign, deepened uncertainty, and opened political space that thousands of Nizari soldiers could never have won in battle. From that point onward, the fidai became more than a physical threat. He became an idea that entered a ruler's mind before any actual mission began. A sultan could increase the number of guards around his chamber, but every additional guard created another person whose loyalty had to be trusted. A commander might limit access to his camp, yet doing so could isolate him from petitioners, messengers, and allies. A governor could avoid public appearances, but medieval authority depended upon visibility. Rulers were expected to attend ceremonies, receive delegations, lead troops, appear at worship, and demonstrate that they were not afraid. The Nizaris exploited a cruel contradiction at the heart of political power. The more important a leader became, the more people needed to approach him, and the more difficult it became to protect him without weakening the relationships that made him powerful. Many actual Nizari attacks reportedly occurred in public settings, where the identity of the target was unmistakable and the political meaning could not easily be hidden. This visibility was not necessarily proof of a desire for theatrical violence. In an age without modern communication, a public event guaranteed that witnesses would carry the story outward. The news would move through markets, courts, mosques, caravan stations, and military camps, becoming less precise and more frightening with every repetition. The choice of a close-range method also had symbolic force, although it should not be romanticized. It communicated that walls, rank, and armed followers could not create absolute distance between a ruler and those he persecuted. Such missions were extraordinarily dangerous, and the participants rarely survived. Their willingness to accept that likelihood confused outside observers who searched for explanations more familiar to them. Some imagined that the fida'is had been drugged, hypnotized, deceived with visions of paradise, or trained from childhood to obey without thought. The surviving evidence does not support those stories, and even hostile Muslim writers who accused the Nizaris of many abuses did not initially explain the fida'is through intoxicants. Their conduct becomes more understandable when placed within the religious culture of sacrifice and martyrdom, combined with the immediate experience of a community whose members faced campaigns, executions, and massacres. This does not make political killing morally simple or historically inevitable. It shows why an individual might interpret a nearly fatal mission not as meaningless death, but as an act capable of protecting relatives, fellow believers, and an entire threatened society. The fida'i was therefore not merely ordered from above. Devotion mattered, though it is impossible to know what mixture of conviction, social pressure, anger, personal loss, and hope motivated each individual. The names of some participants and their missions were reportedly preserved in rolls of honor at major Nizari fortresses, suggesting that their actions were remembered within the community as sacrifice rather than anonymous murder. Yet the strategy carried a terrible cost beyond the lives of the targets and volunteers. Seljuk authorities did not respond only against those directly involved. Suspicion could fall upon entire Ismaili populations, including people who had never entered a fortress or accepted a mission. Arrests, public accusations, and massacres followed Nizari actions, and these reprisals in turn created demands for revenge against those believed to have ordered them. Assassination encouraged massacre. Massacre encouraged further assassination. Each side interpreted its own violence as a necessary response to the violence of the other, allowing the conflict to renew itself while ordinary people carried much of the suffering. The cycle also made evidence increasingly unreliable. Once the Nizaris became famous for striking prominent enemies, nearly every unexplained death of political importance could be assigned to them. A prince could secretly remove a rival and allow the assassins to receive the blame. A court faction could conceal its involvement behind the appearance of an Ismaili plot. A chronicler writing decades later might identify a fida'i because that explanation matched the reputation already established, not because documentation survived. Encyclopedia Iranica notes that almost any major assassination in the Central Islamic lands during the Alamut period eventually risked being attributed to the Nizari dagger. Their enemies thus enlarged the very power they feared. Every doubtful story made the network appear more extensive. Every rumor suggested another hidden adherent, and every unexplained death became evidence that Alamut could reach anywhere. The Nizaris benefited from that uncertainty because a reputation can sometimes achieve what an operation cannot. A commander who believed himself marked might abandon a campaign, negotiate, change his route, distrust his servants, or waste resources guarding against an attack that had never been planned. A whispered threat could become strategically useful without anyone being harmed. But reputation was an unstable weapon. It discouraged some enemies while persuading others that the Nizari community had to be destroyed completely. It also buried the reality of their society beneath the image of the Fidai. Farmers disappeared from the story, scholars vanished, women and children became invisible, and an entire religious community was reduced to a handful of dangerous men. That distortion began during Hassan's own lifetime, not centuries later. By the early 12th century, Seljuk rulers no longer saw Alamut merely as one rebellious fortress among many. They imagined a network that could penetrate their households and turn trusted surroundings into spaces of uncertainty. The Nizaris had found a way to make small numbers cast a long shadow, but shadows grow less controllable as they spread. Soon, every court would have its suspicions. Every unexplained death would produce another accusation, and the Seljuk struggle against Alamut would become not simply a contest for mountains and castles, but a war fought inside the minds of men who could no longer be certain which danger was real. By the opening years of the 12th century, fear had escaped the valleys of Alamut and entered the Seljuk court itself. It moved invisibly through palaces, military camps, government offices, and crowded streets, carried not only by reports of targeted killings, but by something even more destructive: uncertainty. A ruler could fight an army he could see. He could count its horsemen, block its roads, burn its supplies, and measure the distance separating his soldiers from its walls. The Nizaris offered no such comfort. Their fortresses could be located on a map, yet their supporters might already be living in the cities below, speaking the same languages, wearing the same clothing, and serving in the same institutions as everyone around them. Some were committed believers, some may have been political allies, and others were probably innocent people caught beneath a label that had become dangerously broad. The Seljuks no longer feared only what Hasan-i Sabbah controlled, they feared what they could not identify. And once a government begins searching for invisible enemies, suspicion can spread faster than evidence. During the reign of Sultan Bark-Yaruk, from 1094 to 1105, the Nizaris expanded while the Seljuk dynasty was weakened by succession wars. Rival princes competed for authority, military commanders changed sides, and officials who should have been concentrating on Alamut were instead calculating which member of the royal family would survive the next struggle. The Nizaris used this division to establish positions closer to the centers of power, but their success produced a backlash. In 1101, Bark-Yaruk in western Persia and his brother Sanjar in Khorasan reportedly agreed to suppress the movement more systematically within their respective territories. The decision marked a change in the conflict. The Seljuk response would no longer be limited to expeditions against isolated castles. Officials began searching their own armies and administrations for suspected Ismailis, while communities in cities such as Esfahan and Baghdad faced persecution shaped as much by rumor as by proven involvement. This was the moment when the struggle ceased to be only a contest over mountain strongholds and became an atmosphere surrounding ordinary life. A man with an old disagreement, an unusual religious practice, or the wrong acquaintance could suddenly be denounced. A soldier's loyalty might be questioned because of where he came from. A civil servant who had risen too quickly might be accused by rivals who wanted his position. The authorities hoped to cleanse the empire of hidden Nizari influence, but every purge announced that the state itself believed infiltration was widespread. The harder the government searched, the more powerful the unseen network appeared. Suspicion could therefore protect the empire and weaken it at the same time. It might expose genuine agents, but it also damaged trust among the people who kept the Seljuk system functioning. Nowhere was the humiliation more visible than at Shahdiz, the immense fortress overlooking Esfahan. The city was not some distant provincial town. It was one of the most important political and cultural centers of Seljuk power, a place associated with the court, the bureaucracy, and the memory of Sultan Malik Shah's reign. Above it stood a fortified position capable of watching major routes leading toward the capital. Around the year 1100, Shahdiz came under the control of Ahmed ibn Abd al-Malik ibn Attash, the son of Hasan-i Sabbah's former mentor. The manner of its acquisition appears to have followed the pattern already seen elsewhere: quiet missionary work, the cultivation of supporters, and a gradual transformation of allegiance before the political meaning of the change became fully visible. Later accounts claimed that Ahmad attracted tens of thousands of followers in and around Isfahan and collected taxes from nearby districts. Such numbers may have been exaggerated by chroniclers attempting to show the terrifying scale of the threat. But even a much smaller base of support would have been alarming. From Shahdiz, the Nizaris were no longer simply resisting the empire from inaccessible mountains. They were positioned above one of its capitals, close enough to challenge the prestige of the Seljuk dynasty every time officials looked toward the surrounding heights. The fortress became proof that the supposed rebels could operate near the center of imperial life, and that proof was more damaging than the actual territory they controlled. Barkyaruk's reign ended in 1105, and the arrival of Sultan Muhammad Tapar changed the balance. Muhammad inherited a dynasty exhausted by internal conflict, but he succeeded in restoring a greater degree of unity in the western Seljuk lands. That restoration deprived Hasan of one of his most valuable advantages. A divided empire had responded to Alamut unevenly, sending local commanders whose campaigns could be interrupted by court rivalries or abandoned when another prince demanded attention. Muhammad Tapar treated the Nizari challenge as a central problem of the Sultanate. He possessed the authority, resources, and political determination to coordinate a longer war, and he began with the fortress that most directly insulted Seljuk power. In 1107, his forces surrounded Shahdiz. The siege was not a simple collision between walls and soldiers. It became a contest of endurance, negotiation, and political calculation. Ahmad ibn Attash reportedly attempted to delay the outcome through debate and offers of compromise, perhaps hoping that the fragile unity behind the Sultan would break apart before the fortress did. This was not an unreasonable hope. Medieval sieges could end because money ran out, weather changed, disease entered a camp, or a rebellion elsewhere forced an army to leave. But Muhammad Tapar maintained the pressure. Agreements allowed some of those inside to depart, while a smaller group continued resisting. Shahdiz eventually fell. Ahmed and his son were captured and executed, and the fortress was dismantled so that it could not be used in the same way again. The loss was one of the heaviest blows Hasan's movement had yet suffered. Nizari influence around Isfahan declined sharply, and the episode exposed a limit hidden beneath their earlier victories. Infiltration could gain a fortress near an imperial capital, but proximity also ensured that the enemy would concentrate overwhelming resources against it. Shahdiz had extended the Nizari shadow farther than before, yet it had also stepped beyond the protection offered by distance. Muhammad Tapar followed the victory with campaigns against other Nizari positions in the Zagros region, eliminating several strongholds and pushing the movement back toward its more defensible centers in Rudbar, Kumis, and Kohistan. For a time, it may have appeared that the Seljuks had finally discovered the method needed to destroy Hasan's state. First restore unity, then isolate each fortress and remove them one by one. But Alamut was not Shahdiz. Its surrounding mountains, supporting settlements, prepared stores, and network of nearby fortifications made a decisive assault far more difficult. Beginning around 1109, Muhammad Tapar launched a prolonged campaign against the Nizari heartland. Seljuk forces entered the Alamut region repeatedly, attacking supporting territory and attempting to weaken the fortresses through attrition. They understood that walls alone were not the true foundation of Hasan's power. The fields, orchards, villages, roads, and local alliances below those walls allowed the mountain communities to survive. Destroy enough of that world, and perhaps the castles would become empty shells. The strategy placed civilians and ordinary livelihoods at the center of the war. Crops could be damaged, settlements pressured, and movement through the valleys disrupted, while defenders replied with raids, ambushes, and reprisals of their own. The surviving chronicles were written mainly by elites and rarely preserved the voices of families forced to rebuild between campaigns. But their silence should not make those lives invisible. For rulers, the conflict was about legitimacy and security. For villagers, it might mean deciding which authority could protect the next harvest. Amir Shirgir of Sava led sustained operations against Alamut over several years, seeking to achieve through hunger and repeated devastation what direct assault had failed to accomplish. Yet the same geography that made the Nizari state difficult to govern also made it difficult to erase. Seljuk armies could enter the region, but remaining there required a continuing flow of provisions and money. Every additional season created new opportunities for political distraction. Hasan did not have to defeat the Sultan's full military power in open battle. He had only to ensure that the price of continuing the campaign remained greater than the result it produced. The fortresses endured, and each year without a final Seljuk victory carried a psychological meaning of its own. Muhammad Tapar could destroy Shadiz, but he could not demonstrate that Alamut was within his control. The Nizaris, meanwhile, were not winning in the ordinary sense. They had lost territories, followers, and important leaders. Their communities endured repression, their expansion had slowed, and the revolutionary momentum of the 1090s was fading. Yet survival itself became their victory. An empire had directed armies, officials, money, and years of attention against a small mountain state, and the state remained. When Muhammad Tapar died in 1118, the pressure holding the campaign together disappeared. The Seljuk forces withdrew, leaving Alamut unconquered. The result was not triumph for either side, but a stalemate that revealed the limits of both. Hasan could not uproot Seljuk authority from Persia, while the Seljuks could not eliminate the Nizari territories that had formed inside their world. Between them lay a landscape of fortified borders, damaged communities, negotiated pauses, and unresolved revenge. Fear now became a permanent part of their relationship. Some Seljuk commanders continued to attack. Others negotiated when destruction seemed too costly. In Khorasan, Sanjar's forces inflicted serious losses on Nizari communities, yet agreements were also reached when commanders judged compromise more practical than endless war. Later tradition would tell a far more dramatic story, that an agent entered Sanjar's sleeping chamber and planted a dagger beside his bed, followed by a warning from Alamut, frightening the Sultan into peace. The tale perfectly captures the reputation the Nizaris acquired, but firm contemporary evidence for the episode is lacking, and it should be treated as legend rather than established fact. Its survival is nevertheless revealing. People believed Hasan could reach a sultan while he slept because years of uncertainty had taught them that the impossible might already have happened. By the final years of Hasan-i Sabbah's life, his movement had lost some of its offensive energy but gained something more durable: recognition that it could not easily be removed. Seljuk rulers still denounced it, attacked it, and feared its hidden supporters, yet they also had to calculate when negotiation might achieve more than another siege. The struggle had transformed Alamut from a rebellion the empire expected to crush into a political reality it was forced to endure. And as reports of that endurance traveled westward towards Syria and the lands of the Crusaders, outsiders began searching for an explanation. Discipline, geography, organization, and religious conviction seemed too ordinary to account for men who resisted armies and accepted missions from which they might never return. A darker answer was more satisfying. Soon there would be stories of hashish, false paradises, and a mountain lord who could command human beings as though they no longer possessed wills of their own. And once those stories entered history, they would prove even harder to destroy than Alamut's walls. The lie survived because it explained everything too perfectly. Somewhere behind the walls of Alamut, according to the story later repeated across Europe, Hasan-i Sabbah maintained a garden so beautiful that anyone entering it believed he had awakened inside paradise. Streams ran beneath fruit trees, music drifted through painted pavilions, and young women waited among tables covered with food and wine. Selected recruits were supposedly drugged with hashish, carried into this hidden world while unconscious, and allowed to experience its pleasures before being drugged again and removed. When they awoke outside the garden, the master of the fortress promised that obedience would return them to paradise forever. From that moment, the tale claimed, they would follow any command, accept any danger, and surrender their lives without hesitation. It was an unforgettable explanation for the fidais, and that was precisely the problem. It transformed a complicated religious and political movement into a theatrical machine of intoxication and mind control, replacing difficult questions about faith, persecution, loyalty, and survival with a secret potion and an enchanted garden. The historical evidence for this system is not weak. It is effectively absent. No reliable contemporary Nizari source describes it, and even medieval Muslim historians, who were intensely hostile toward the Ismailis, do not accuse them of systematically drugging their devotees before missions. Those writers had every reason to include such a charge if they knew of it. They condemned Ismaili beliefs, portrayed their political aims as dangerous, and sometimes repeated extreme accusations against them. Yet the supposed method that would later define the assassins in European imagination is missing from their accounts. Modern historians, therefore, generally treat the hashish indoctrination story and the Garden of Paradise as legends developed outside the Nizari community, rather than descriptions of an actual institution. The myth began not with a discovery inside Alamut, but with a word used as an insult. Muslim opponents sometimes referred to the Nizaris by forms of the Arabic term hashishi or hashishiyah. Because these words resemble the Arabic name for hashish, later Europeans assumed they must identify people who consumed the drug. Yet in the medieval polemical context, the label appears to have functioned more broadly as abuse, suggesting people of low status, disreputable behavior, or contemptible morality. It was closer to calling an enemy rabble than providing a clinical description of what he consumed. No surviving Muslim source that applies the insult explains it by claiming the Nizaris used hashish in a special religious ritual. Crusaders and other European observers encountered variations of this term in Syria, reproduced its unfamiliar sounds as words such as assassini, and eventually carried it into European languages. Once detached from its original setting, the name slowly changed meaning. A hostile nickname for the Nizari Ismailis became the word assassin, no longer describing one disputed medieval community, but any person who killed a prominent figure for political reasons. The transformation was so complete that the insult eventually outlived the people against whom it had first been directed. The drug story probably grew from an attempt to answer a question that frightened outside observers. Why would a person knowingly undertake a mission from which escape seemed unlikely? To Crusaders raised within their own traditions of martyrdom and sacred warfare, the idea of dying for belief should not have been entirely foreign. Yet the Nizari Fidais belonged to a community they barely understood. Their loyalties seemed hidden, their teachings unfamiliar, and their willingness to approach powerful targets at close range appeared irrational to those who could not see the world from inside a besieged minority. Intoxication provided a convenient answer. If the Fidai acted under the influence of a drug, then his devotion did not need to be taken seriously. If he had been deceived by a false paradise, his courage could be reduced to manipulation. If he obeyed because his mind had been captured by an all-powerful master, there was no need to examine the political conditions that had made Alamut possible. The legend reassured its audience by turning conviction into trickery. It also made the Nizari leader more terrifying. He was no longer merely an organizer commanding fortresses and missionaries. He became a magician of human behavior, capable of removing a person's will and replacing it with his own. Such an enemy could not be understood through ordinary politics, because he seemed to operate beyond ordinary humanity. This image developed most strongly in the lands of the Crusades during the later 12th century, when European chroniclers came into contact with the Syrian Nizaris led by Rashid al-Din Sinan. It was Sinan, not Hasan-i Sabbah, whom Crusader circles originally described as the old man of the mountain. Later retellings blurred the two men together, carrying the title backward from Syria to Alamut, and treating different periods, regions, and leaders as though they belonged to one timeless secret order. The legends did not appear in their complete form all at once. They accumulated. One storyteller emphasized absolute obedience. Another imagined recruits trained from childhood. Others described dramatic demonstrations in which devotees supposedly obeyed commands that placed their lives in immediate danger. Each new account borrowed elements from earlier rumors and added something more vivid. The process resembled the growth of a fortress built not from stone but from repetition. A detail did not have to be verified if it resembled a detail people already expected to hear. By the 13th century, the Nizaris had become ideal characters for European tales about the mysterious East, isolated in mountains, ruled by an unseen master, possessing secret knowledge, and willing to commit acts that appeared incomprehensible to outsiders. The more distant the audience was from Syria or Persia, the easier it became to accept elaborate descriptions of places no listener could inspect. Yet, not every European observer contributed equally to the fantasy. William of Tyre, who lived in the eastern Mediterranean for many years and possessed a comparatively strong knowledge of regional politics, did not construct the same intoxicating legends. That absence suggests that proximity alone did not create understanding, but better information could reduce the need for invention. The most extravagant accounts often came from writers who knew the Nizaris indirectly, through rumor, translation, and stories already shaped for entertainment. The version that conquered the European imagination was eventually associated with Marco Polo. Writing about the East near the end of the 13th century, after the Mongols had already captured Alamut in 1256, Marco described a mountain ruler called Ala-ud-Din, who supposedly created a magnificent garden modeled on the Quranic paradise. Young men were intoxicated, transported into it, and persuaded that only their master could restore them to eternal pleasure. Marco did not invent every part of the story. By his time, European accounts had already connected the assassins with extraordinary obedience and intoxicating substances. His achievement was to combine these separate rumors into one complete narrative with a setting, method, motive, and dramatic logic. The garden gave the legend scenery. The drug explained how recruits entered and left without understanding what had happened. The promise of return explained their obedience. The old man supplied a villain powerful enough to control the entire design. It was a masterpiece of storytelling, which is not the same as reliable history. Marco's account was produced generations after Hasan-i Sabbah's death and after the political world of Alamut had been destroyed. He offered no verifiable witness from inside the fortress and no documentary evidence that the garden existed. When the Persian historian Malik Juwayni entered Alamut following its surrender to the Mongols, he examined its celebrated library, strong storage facilities, and carefully engineered water systems. He wrote with open hostility toward the Nizaris and participated in the destruction of many of their writings. Yet even he did not report finding the luxurious garden that later imagination placed at the center of the fortress. Its absence is difficult to dismiss. A complex capable of deceiving generations of recruits would have required space, water, servants, food, architecture, and secrecy on a mountain already organized for defense and survival. Such a project would have left more than a charming story told far away and many decades later. There is also a deeper reason the myth should be questioned. Drugs do not reliably manufacture disciplined political loyalty. Intoxication may alter perception, but it cannot by itself create years of trust, teach a person whom to approach, sustain secrecy across long journeys, or convince communities to protect a movement through repeated sieges. The Fidais did not emerge from an empty world waiting for a chemical command. They came from Nizari society, a society shaped by religious allegiance, political conflict, communal memory, and the experience of being surrounded by hostile powers. Some volunteers may have lost relatives during campaigns or persecution. Others may have believed that their sacrifice defended the imam and protected fellow believers. Social pressure, personal ambition, anger, devotion, and hope may all have played different roles, and the surviving evidence rarely allows historians to reconstruct an individual mind. That uncertainty is less satisfying than the garden story, but it is closer to how human beings actually behave. No single mechanism explains every person, especially across nearly 2 centuries and widely separated territories. The legend erased that variety because it was designed to explain the Fida'i from the outside. It did not ask what he believed, it declared that he had been deceived. Long before European stories of hashish appeared, Muslim polemicists had already constructed what modern scholars sometimes call an anti-Ismaili black legend. Ismailis were accused of hiding secret levels of teaching, rejecting religion from within, and participating in a conspiracy whose visible doctrines concealed far darker aims. These accusations developed during centuries of political and theological conflict, and they prepared audiences to believe almost any claim about concealed Nizari practices. When Crusaders later encountered the Syrian branch, they inherited a region already filled with hostile descriptions. European imaginative storytelling and Muslim sectarian polemic did not produce identical legends, but together they created an environment in which the Nizaris could be portrayed as uniquely deceptive and inhuman. Once accepted, the tale became almost impossible to remove. Medieval readers repeated it because it was thrilling. 19th century European scholars repeated portions of it because many authentic Nizari texts remained unavailable, lost, concealed, or destroyed. Novelists repeated it because the image of a secret paradise and drugged killers was more dramatic than irrigation channels, theological debates, and negotiated alliances. Modern entertainment inherited the same pattern, often turning a fragmented medieval community into an eternal organization operating behind every major political event. Even when details changed, the central fantasy remained. Somewhere behind history stood a hidden master whose followers had surrendered their minds. The truth was more complicated and perhaps more unsettling. Hassan and the leaders who followed him did not need a magical garden to inspire loyalty. They ruled a community that believed it possessed legitimate spiritual guidance, faced enemies with vastly greater resources, and had learned to treat individual sacrifice as one possible instrument of survival. The Nizaris were capable of calculated political violence, but they were not supernatural, and reducing them to intoxicated killers concealed both their humanity and their responsibility. A drugged puppet cannot make a moral decision. A committed person can. and that makes the real history harder to dismiss as fantasy. The Garden of Paradise was almost certainly never hidden behind the walls of Alamut. Yet in the European imagination, it became more durable than the fortress itself. Stone could be broken by Mongol siege engines, libraries could burn, and dynasties could vanish. But a story that answered fear with wonder could cross languages and centuries without needing proof. By the time scholars began dismantling the legend, the word born from an insult had already entered everyday speech. Hasan had inherited a title that originally belonged to another man, and the Nizaris had become prisoners of a tale written largely by people who had never entered their world. But while Europe was turning them into myth, their Syrian communities were entering a new and more dangerous struggle, caught between Muslim dynasties and Crusader states. And from the fortress of Masyaf, a leader would emerge whose real career was remarkable enough without any garden at all. In the mountains west of Hama, where the green ridges of inland Syria begin descending toward the Mediterranean, the fortress of Masyaf rose above a landscape far more crowded and dangerous than the valleys surrounding Alamut. Persia had offered the Nizaris distance, high passes, and regions where imperial control weakened against geography. But Syria offered almost no empty space in which a small community could quietly grow. Every road seemed to lead toward someone else's territory. To the east lay the great cities of Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus, fought over by competing Muslim dynasties. To the west stood the coastal strongholds of the Crusaders, including castles held by military orders whose wealth and professional soldiers made them dangerous neighbors. Between those powers were local lords, tribal alliances, fortified towns, and mountain communities whose loyalties could change whenever a stronger army appeared. The Syrian Nizaris had entered this political maze during the early 12th century, but their first attempts to secure permanent territory were uncertain and costly. They briefly gained influence in Aleppo under the Seljuk ruler Ridwan, only to face persecution after his death in 1113. They then sought opportunities farther south, where a failed attempt to obtain a foothold in Damascus ended in disaster in 1129. Thousands were reportedly killed in the repression that followed, although medieval estimates are often difficult to verify and may have been enlarged by hostile chroniclers. The lesson was unmistakable. Cities could offer access to power, but they could also become traps. The survivors turned toward the Jabal Bahra, a broken belt of hills between the Syrian interior and the coastal plain, where compact fortresses could protect communities that had learned not to depend on the favor of urban rulers. During the 1130s and early 1140s, the Nizaris acquired a cluster of strongholds that included Kadmus, Kaf, Khawabi, and Masyaf, creating a Syrian network that was smaller than its Persian counterpart, but positioned at the center of the struggle for the eastern Mediterranean. Masyaf became its most famous castle, though Kaf may have served as the principal residence of its greatest leader. The Syrian fortresses were generally more compact than the monumental strongholds of Persia, yet they were rebuilt, reinforced, supplied with water, and prepared to endure long periods of pressure. They were not isolated points on barren peaks. Villages, farms, roads, and local communities surrounded them, giving the Nizaris enough territory to survive while forcing them to negotiate constantly with powers far greater than themselves. Into this precarious world came Rashid al-Din Sinan, the man Crusader writers would remember as the original Old Man of the Mountain. He was not born among the Syrian castles and did not belong to the generation that first acquired them. Sources place his birth sometime between 1126 and 1135 in a village near Basra in southern Iraq, where he grew up in a Shi'i family and reportedly worked as a schoolmaster before embracing Nizari Ismailism. Almost everything about his early life must be handled carefully. The only surviving Ismaili biography of Sinan was composed centuries later and presents him through the language of devotion and miracle, while non-Ismaili accounts often viewed him through suspicion. Between those traditions, a more credible outline remains visible. As a young man, Sinan traveled east to Alamut, where he studied Ismaili thought and gained access to the fortress's intellectual resources. He became associated with Hasan II, then the heir to the leadership of the Persian Nizaris, and learned within a political culture that valued scholarship, secrecy, endurance, and the careful reading of human motives. When Hasan II assumed power in 1162, he sent Sinan to Syria. It may have looked like a distant appointment to a troubled frontier, but Syria was becoming the place where the Nizaris faced their most complicated test. Sinan did not arrive at Masyaf and immediately announce himself as master. He initially remained at Kaf, where he taught and gradually built support among the local community. The existing chief missionary, Abu Muhammad, still held authority, and the Syrian leadership was already troubled by internal rivalries. Sinan waited. This patience would define his career more clearly than the theatrical cruelty later legends attributed to him. He listened to local concerns, learned which commanders could be trusted, studied the distances between the castles, and allowed his reputation to grow before claiming a position he could securely hold. When Abu Muhammad died, a succession dispute followed, and Sinan emerged as leader, under instructions from Alamut. He would retain that authority for roughly 3 decades without a successful challenge from within Syria. His achievement was not simply that he ruled for a long time, but that he transformed a vulnerable collection of mountain enclaves into a recognizable regional power. He moved regularly among Masyaf, Kaf, and Kedmis, rather than hiding permanently within a single fortress. He restored or strengthened older positions, including Rusafa and Khawabi, acquired Ulaika near the great hospitaller castle of Markab, and improved the links connecting the Syrian strongholds. Each castle served a slightly different purpose. Some watched routes from the coast toward the interior. Others protected agricultural districts or offered refuge when a neighboring ruler turned hostile. Together they formed a defensive web across terrain where no one power could move without encountering the interests of several others. Sinan's greatest skill was understanding that this crowded political landscape could not be survived through permanent friendship or permanent hatred. The Crusader states were enemies in one moment and possible partners in another. The Zangid rulers of Aleppo and Mosul could threaten Nizari independence while also blocking the expansion of another dynasty. Saladin's growing power might promise unity against the Crusaders, yet that same unity could place the Syrian Nizaris under a ruler strong enough to eliminate their autonomy. Sinan therefore entered a shifting web of truces, payments, negotiations, threats, and temporary alliances. To later observers, such changes could look like betrayal, but loyalty to a larger Muslim or Christian bloc would have made little sense from inside Masyaf. Sinan's first responsibility was to preserve a small community surrounded by forces that did not consider its independence legitimate. He dealt with each neighbor according to the danger of the moment, revising policy whenever the balance shifted. This did not mean he controlled events. He could not command the resources of Damascus, Cairo, Aleppo, or Jerusalem, and one mistaken calculation might expose every Nizari village in Syria. His influence came from making the cost of destroying his community difficult to predict. A ruler considering an attack had to ask not only whether he could take a fortress, but what alliances might change while he was trying, which rival might benefit, and whether his own officers would remain safe. Sinan also possessed unusual authority within the Nizari world itself. He had been sent from Alamut, but distance allowed him to govern Syria with considerable independence. Messages traveling between Persia and Syria crossed territories controlled by rival rulers, and local crises could not wait for instructions that might take weeks to arrive. Sinan interpreted doctrine, appointed local representatives, directed diplomacy, and developed policies suited to Syrian conditions. When Hasan II proclaimed the Qiyamah, or spiritual resurrection, at Alamut in 1164, Sinan introduced the new teaching to the Syrian community, but sources suggest that he presented it in his own way and that it never took roots there as deeply as it did in Persia. During the long rule of Hasan II's successor, Nur al-Din Muhammad II, tension may even have developed between Sinan and Alamut. Some accounts claim attempts were made to remove him, though the evidence is complicated and the complete break apparently never occurred. It would therefore be misleading to describe Sinan either as an obedient provincial official or as the founder of an entirely separate order. He remained part of the wider Nizari structure while acting with a freedom demanded by distance, personality, and local necessity. That ambiguity increased his reputation. To the Syrian Nizaris, he was the leader who understood the world immediately surrounding them. To distant observers, he appeared almost sovereign, a mountain ruler who answered to no king they could see. The title, later translated as Old Man of the Mountain, emerged from this environment. Old Man did not necessarily describe Sinan's age. It reflected the Arabic and Persian use of terms such as sheikh for a respected elder, teacher, or leader. Crusaders heard the title, connected it with the fortified hills in which the Nizaris lived, and turned Sinan into a figure who seemed to rule every assassin fortress from Syria to Persia. The title would later be incorrectly transferred backward to Hasan-i Sabbah, merging two different leaders into one legendary master. Sinan himself became the center of stories claiming he could foresee danger, disappear from guarded places, or command followers with a gesture. A later devotional biography credited him with miracles, while hostile and European accounts made him a master of terror. These traditions disagree in purpose, yet both reveal the extraordinary authority he acquired. The historical Sinan did not need supernatural power to seem mysterious. He appeared where he was needed, traveled among castles under constant threat, survived internal disputes, and negotiated with rulers who commanded armies many times larger than his own. His strongest weapon may have been that no outsider could determine exactly how far his influence extended. Even the organization of the Syrian Fidais appears to have become more formal under his leadership, providing another layer of uncertainty for those considering war against Masyaf. Reports of their absolute obedience were exaggerated and became raw material for the assassin legends, but the political fear surrounding them was real enough to affect decisions. Yet life beneath Sinan's authority was not an endless procession of secret missions. Masyaf and the other fortresses required the same unglamorous labor that sustained every medieval society. Water had to be protected, grain collected, walls repaired, disputes judged, and relations maintained with villages whose survival could not be separated from that of the castles. A successful leader had to know when a harvest was weak as carefully as he knew which prince was marching toward Hama. He needed messengers who could cross hostile territory, administrators who would not steal supplies, commanders who could act independently, and teachers capable of preserving communal identity among people living beside Sunni Muslims and Latin Christians. Sinan's state was small enough that mistakes could not be hidden beneath enormous wealth, yet complicated enough that personal charisma alone could not govern it. The fact that the Syrian Nizaris remained independent through his lifetime suggests that the machinery beneath the legend worked. By the 1170s, Masyaf no longer represented a frightened refugee community clinging to a mountain. It had become the visible center of a power every major ruler in Syria had to include in his calculations. That recognition, however, brought a new danger. Saladin had begun uniting Egypt and Syria under a single expanding authority, removing the divisions that had allowed smaller groups to survive between rival states. For Sinan, the rise of such a ruler could not be viewed only as a victory against the Crusaders. A united empire might eventually turn toward the mountains and decide that Masyaf's independence had lasted long enough. Soon, stories would claim that Sinan's followers entered Saladin's camp, passed through layers of guards, and left warnings beside the sleeping commander. Some versions were almost certainly embellished, but behind them stood a confrontation that was entirely real. The old man of the mountain and the most celebrated Muslim ruler of the crusading age were moving toward one another, and neither could yet know whether the meeting would end in destruction, alliance, or a bargain. History would struggle to explain. Saladin's rise changed the meaning of every road leading away from the Nizari fortresses. For decades, the Syrian community had survived because power around it remained divided. Aleppo watched Damascus. Damascus watched Egypt. The Crusader lords distrusted one another, and the military orders often followed interests of their own. Masyaf existed inside the spaces between those rivalries, but Saladin was steadily closing those spaces. After bringing the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt to an end in 1171, he moved northward and entered Damascus in 1174, presenting himself as the ruler capable of uniting Muslim territories against the Crusader states. To many contemporaries, that promise carried enormous appeal. To Rashid al-Din Sinan, however, unity was not automatically reassuring. A ruler powerful enough to challenge the Crusaders might also become powerful enough to eliminate every smaller community that refused to submit. The Nizaris did not possess the population, wealth, or armies needed to meet Saladin on equal terms. Their survival depended on preventing him from treating them as a minor obstacle that could be removed after a single campaign. The relationship between the two men therefore began not with friendship, but with fear, pressure, and conflicting political needs. Medieval chronicles describe at least 2 attempts against Saladin during his campaigns in northern Syria. The accounts disagree about dates, locations, and details, which is common when later writers reconstruct events already surrounded by legend. In one version, several men entered an Ayyubid camp but were recognized before reaching the commander. In another, attackers came dangerously close to Saladin during the siege of Azaz in 1176, and he escaped partly because protective armor reduced the severity of the attack. It is difficult to know how much of the surviving narrative was shaped by later storytelling, but the underlying threat appears to have been taken seriously. Saladin tightened the security around his person, restricted access to his quarters, and began treating the Syrian Nizaris as more than an irritating mountain faction. They had demonstrated that their power did not end at the walls of their castles. Yet the attacks also brought consequences. A weapon that creates fear can provoke the very confrontation it is intended to prevent, and Saladin soon moved directly into Nizari territory. His forces entered the mountains and laid siege to Masyaf, the fortress most closely associated with Sinan's authority. From below, the castle looked exposed against the sky, but appearances could be deceptive. An army might surround the mountain, yet occupying the surrounding ground did not guarantee possession of the walls above. Siege equipment had to be moved across difficult terrain. Food, animals, and water had to be supplied every day. The longer the army remained, the more time Saladin's rivals had to move elsewhere. Even if Masyaf fell, other strongholds such as Kaf, Khadmus, and Khawabi would remain beyond it, each defended by its own terrain and surrounding communities. The Nizari state in Syria was small, but it had been designed so that no single victory would automatically destroy the whole. the siege ended before a final assault. Mediation was arranged, probably through the ruler of Hama, who was related to Saladin and understood that a prolonged war in the mountains might destabilize the region without giving either side a decisive result. Saladin withdrew after reaching an understanding with Sinan, and direct hostilities between them largely ceased. The historical explanation is practical. Both men had other dangers to face. Neither could easily destroy the other without paying a high price, and continued war would have benefited their rivals. But practical settlements rarely satisfy the imagination, especially when one of the participants already possesses a reputation for secret violence. Later stories claimed that Sinan's followers entered Saladin's camp while he slept, passed through every layer of security, and left a warning close to his bed. Some versions mention a weapon, others a poisoned cake, and still others a threatening message accompanied by hot cakes marked with a distinctive sign. Saladin supposedly awoke to understand that the old man of the mountain could reach him whenever he wished. There is no reliable contemporary evidence confirming these dramatic scenes. They may preserve a distorted memory of threats exchanged during the negotiations, or they may have been invented to explain why a powerful ruler abandoned the siege. Either way, the legend reveals something important about the political effect of Nizari reputation. Saladin commanded armies that could overwhelm almost any force Sinan placed in the field, but military superiority did not erase personal vulnerability. The story gave that invisible balance a physical image. The great sultan sleeping beneath armed protection while a message from the mountains appeared beside him. The agreement did not turn Sinan into Saladin's servant, nor did it create a permanent alliance. It produced a cautious peace between two leaders who understood that neither could afford to view the other through religious hostility alone. Saladin needed to concentrate on the Crusader states and rival Muslim powers. Sinan needed time to preserve the autonomy of his scattered castles. Their coexistence was not based on trust. It rested on the knowledge that renewed conflict might cost more than either side gained. The same realism shaped Sinan's relations with the Christians. Medieval Syria was not divided neatly into one Muslim camp and one Christian camp. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and individual noble families often pursued different goals. Alliances could cross religious boundaries when immediate interests demanded it, and enemies who fought one year might negotiate the next. Sinan understood this world without sentimentality. The Crusaders could threaten Nizari villages, demand payments, or block access to roads, but they could also serve as a counterweight against a Muslim ruler growing too powerful. Around 1173, Sinan reportedly opened negotiations with King Amalric I of Jerusalem. The precise purpose remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest he wanted relief from tribute paid to the Templars, and may even have offered a closer political relationship. The negotiations ended violently when a Nizari envoy returning from the royal court was killed by members of the temple. Amalric reacted angrily and demanded punishment, but his death in 1174 prevented the episode from reaching a clear conclusion. The incident exposed how fragmented Crusader politics could be. A king might find cooperation with Sinan useful, while a military order could see the same agreement as a threat to its income and independence. Masyaf survived by recognizing those divisions and refusing to treat any neighboring power as permanently friendly or permanently hostile. After Saladin's victory at Hattin in 1187 and the recovery of Jerusalem, the political landscape shifted again. Much of the Crusader kingdom collapsed, but Tyre remained in Christian hands under Conrad of Montferrat, a determined nobleman who arrived when the city appeared close to surrender. Conrad organized its defense, refused Saladin's demands, and turned Tyre into the foundation from which the Crusader position began to recover. During the Third Crusade, he became locked in a bitter struggle with Guy of Lusignan over the crown of Jerusalem. Richard I of England initially favored Guy, while Philip II of France and many local barons supported Conrad. This was not a ceremonial dispute. The future king would influence military strategy, control surviving territory, shape negotiations with Saladin, and determine which factions benefited from the crusade. In April 1192, the nobles selected Conrad. His long contest for power seemed finally settled. Only days later, while walking through the streets of Tyre, he was approached by two men who had reportedly spent months gaining access to his surroundings. They were identified as Nizari Ismailis. Conrad was killed before he could be crowned. One assailant died during the attack, and the other was captured. The consequences were immediate. The leadership of the kingdom changed at a critical moment. Conrad's pregnant wife Isabella was soon married to Henry of Champagne, and negotiations with Saladin continued under a different political order. The attackers were almost certainly connected to the Syrian Nizaris, but the question of who ordered the operation has never been answered with confidence. Some accounts claimed Sinan acted because Conrad had previously seized a Nizari vessel or refused to return property, though the evidence is uncertain. Others suspected Richard, whose political interests had collided with Conrad's, yet no decisive proof links the English king to the plot. Saladin was also accused, despite the fact that Conrad's removal did not guarantee a more favorable Christian leadership. Rival Crusader factions may have benefited as well. Even statements attributed to the surviving attacker cannot settle the matter, because testimony produced under captivity could be shaped by coercion, rumor, or the interests of those recording it. The uncertainty became more powerful than any single explanation. If Sinan acted independently, then Masyaf had removed a ruler it considered dangerous. If he acted at another monarch's request, the Nizaris had become secret participants in the succession politics of Jerusalem. If no major ruler commissioned the attack, the operation still demonstrated that a community with no large army could alter the leadership of a kingdom at the exact moment authority was changing hands. The Nizaris did not capture Tyre or defeat the Crusader forces in battle. They struck one human point upon which many political arrangements depended, and the entire structure shifted around the absence they created. Yet their influence should not be mistaken for complete control. They could disrupt events, but they could not dictate everything that followed. Their agents could fail, information could be false, agreements could collapse, and retaliation could threaten communities far removed from the original target. The legend remembered successful missions and quietly forgot the plans that ended in discovery or death before reaching their purpose. By the early 1190s, Sinan had achieved something more important than conquest. The Syrian Nizaris still possessed their castles and enough independence to negotiate with every major power surrounding them. Saladin had not destroyed them. The Crusader lords had not absorbed them. Their survival rested on a dangerous balance of diplomacy, fear, tribute, geography, and carefully chosen violence. Sinan died in 1193, the same year Saladin died in Damascus. One left behind a celebrated dynasty and the memory of great military victories. The other left a small mountain community and a reputation so powerful that foreign writers would spend centuries enlarging it. But the deepest transformation of the Nizari world was no longer taking place between the armies of Saladin and the courts of the Crusaders. Far to the east, within the walls of Alamut, scholars and leaders were turning inward toward questions of revelation, law, and spiritual authority. preparing a declaration that would make the political violence surrounding the assassins seem almost secondary to the revolution unfolding inside their faith. Inside Alamut, the most unsettling revolution of the Nizari age did not begin with a secret mission or a ruler's death. It began with a change in the meaning of time. For generations, the community had lived in expectation, convinced that the rightful imam descended from Nizar remained hidden from the wider world, while representatives at Alamut protected his followers and interpreted his guidance. That hiddenness shaped every part of their existence. It explained why their enemies appeared to dominate the cities, why the faithful endured isolation, and why truth sometimes had to remain concealed behind outward caution. But waiting creates its own pressure. A community can survive on the promise of a future revelation only if that promise continues to feel alive. And by the middle of the 12th century, Alamut was no longer merely preserving the movement Hasan-i Sabbah had founded. It was becoming the setting for a profound reinterpretation of what the movement believed itself to be. The fortress remained a place of soldiers, granaries, cisterns, and guarded paths. Yet behind those practical defenses stood another world, built from manuscripts, sermons, philosophical arguments, and questions about the relationship between visible law and hidden truth. The Nizaris had inherited a tradition that distinguished between the outward form of religion and its inward meaning. Ritual, scripture, and legal practice belonged to the visible surface, but beneath them lay deeper truths accessible through the guidance of the imam. This did not necessarily mean that outward practice was meaningless. Under Hasan-i Sabbah and his immediate successors, religious discipline had reportedly been enforced with great seriousness. The community's survival depended partly on order, and order was expressed through conduct as much as belief. Yet the tension between outer form and inner meaning never disappeared. If the imam possessed the authority to reveal the deepest purpose of revelation, what would happen when that truth was no longer hidden? Would the forms required during an age of concealment remain necessary once the spiritual reality behind them had been unveiled? These were not harmless questions discussed in isolation from politics. They touched the foundation of authority at Alamut, because the person able to announce such a transformation would have to speak with more than the voice of an administrator. In 1162, leadership passed to Hasan II, a young man remembered by the Nizaris with the honorific phrase, "Upon his mention be peace." He had grown up inside the fortress and had already gained attention before taking power, partly because of his learning, eloquence, and intense interest in religious interpretation. Some followers apparently suspected that he was more than the son of the previous ruler, Muhammad ibn Buzurgumid. Rumors connected him directly to the hidden line of imams descended from Nizar, though the precise development of those claims remains difficult to reconstruct. The surviving narratives come largely through later historians who were hostile to the Nizaris and wrote after many of Alamut's own records had been destroyed. Their accounts preserve essential information, but they also present the community's doctrines through the language of accusation. What appears clear is that Hasan II prepared carefully for a declaration that would alter Nizari life. Representatives from different territories were summoned to Alamut, linking distant communities to the ceremony about to unfold. On August 8, 1164, corresponding to the 17th day of Ramadan, people gathered in the fortress courtyard beneath the mountain sky. A pulpit had been arranged facing west, and banners were displayed in a setting whose symbolism later chroniclers described in detail. Hasan delivered a sermon and announced that new instructions had come from the hidden imam. The age of Qiyamah, the resurrection, had arrived. To an outsider, the word might suggest the literal end of the world, the dead rising, history collapsing, and final judgment beginning before the eyes of those assembled. But the Nizari understanding appears to have been more inward and more radical. Qiyamah could mean the unveiling of spiritual truth, a resurrection of understanding in which believers were awakened from attachment to appearances and brought into recognition of the Imam's living guidance. The world outside the walls continued. Fields still required labor, enemies remained in power, and winter would still close the mountain paths. Yet within the community, sacred history had crossed an invisible boundary. The faithful were told that they no longer stood merely in an age of concealment, waiting for reality to be revealed at some distant moment. For them, the truth represented by resurrection had become present. That declaration was soon repeated in other Nizari territories, including a ceremony at Mominabad in Quistan later in 1164, showing that this was not intended as a private revelation limited to those who had stood in Alamut's courtyard. The most controversial question concerns what Qiyamah meant for Islamic law. Hostile Persian historians later claimed that Hasan II abolished the Sharia and released his followers from religious obligations. Their descriptions encouraged generations of readers to imagine a community celebrating the abandonment of faith itself. Modern scholarship approaches those claims with far greater caution. Within Ismaili thought, the proclamation may have meant that outward observance was no longer the highest expression of religion for those admitted into the unveiled spiritual reality of the Imam. It did not necessarily amount to a simple declaration that morality, devotion, or disciplined life no longer mattered. In fact, the inward truth could be understood as more demanding, because actions could no longer be performed merely from habit or social expectation. The believer was asked to recognize the meaning beneath the act. Still, the practical consequences may not have been identical in every Nizari region, and the loss of contemporary community records prevents absolute certainty. Even among modern scholars, Qiyamah remains open to different emphases: theological transformation, political response, messianic expectation, or a combination of all three. What can be said with confidence is that it placed the Imam at the center of religious understanding and separated the Nizaris more sharply from the Sunni societies surrounding them. Hasan II's position also changed. At first, he presented the declaration as instructions transmitted from the hidden Imam, but Nizari tradition came to identify Hasan himself as the Imam, descended from the line of Nizar rather than merely from the family that had governed Alamut since Hasan-i Sabbah's death. Later explanations claimed that a descendant of Nizar had been brought secretly to Alamut, and that the visible ruling line had concealed the true genealogy for protection. Whether every detail of that account can be established historically is uncertain, but its religious significance is unmistakable. The Imam was no longer imagined as a distant figure whose representative ruled from the mountain. He was present at the center of the community. The fortress that had once guarded the memory of an absent authority had become the residence of a manifest one. This transformation gave Alamut a significance no military victory could have produced. Its ruler was not simply a commander defending territory or a chief missionary interpreting messages. For believers, he embodied the source through which the hidden meaning of revelation became accessible. Such authority could unite a scattered community, but it could also provoke resistance from those disturbed by the pace or implications of change. Hasan II's reign ended abruptly in January 1166, less than 4 years after he assumed leadership and less than 2 years after the declaration of Qiyamah. He was killed at Lamasar by a man connected to the older ruling elite, apparently during a period of internal tension. The precise motive remains uncertain. Later accounts describe the killer as an opponent of Hasan's religious innovations, though personal rivalry and political conflict may also have played a role. The assassination is a reminder that Alamut was not a perfectly unified society, moving silently beneath the will of one master. It contained disagreements, loyalties, anxieties, and competing understandings of what the community should become. The very movement outsiders imagined as the model of absolute obedience experienced conflict at its highest level. Hassan's death, however, did not end the new doctrine. His teenage son, Nur al-Din Muhammad II, succeeded him and ruled for more than 4 decades, giving Qiyamah a depth and permanence it might otherwise have lacked. He formally affirmed his father as the Imam and developed the teaching around the living Imam's authority, the contrast between outward appearance and inner reality, and the spiritual condition of resurrection. Under Muhammad II, the Nizari state entered a period that was less dramatic in military expansion, but intellectually more settled. Alamut did not stop being a fortress, yet its identity as a center of thought became increasingly important. Its libraries held works on theology, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and other fields cultivated across the medieval Islamic world. The Nizaris did not exist outside that wider intellectual culture, despite their political isolation. They read many of the same thinkers, inherited many of the same philosophical traditions, and engaged with questions debated from Cairo to Central Asia. Their difference lay in how they placed the Imam's teaching at the center of the search for certainty. Reason could lead the mind far, but human disagreement demonstrated that reason alone did not produce one universally accepted truth. For the Nizaris, authoritative instruction completed what independent argument could not. Alamut's scholars were therefore not choosing between thought and faith. They were asking how thought reached its proper destination. This intellectual life continued through later changes in doctrine and political policy. In the early 13th century, as Mongol pressure began driving scholars and officials away from devastated regions of eastern Iran, Nizari fortresses offered protection to some who needed refuge. The most celebrated was Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, one of the great philosophers and scientists of the medieval world. He spent many years in Nizari territories, first in Kihistan and later at Alamut and Maimundiz. Whether he remained entirely by choice is debated. Some later accounts portray him as a captive, while other evidence suggests a more complex relationship involving patronage, protection, service, and changing political necessity. During these years, he produced important works, including writings that gave sophisticated expression to Nizari concepts of the imamate, spiritual resurrection, human perfection, and submission to truth. His Meadow of Submission became the most comprehensive surviving theological work associated with the later Alamut period. The presence of a thinker of Tusi's stature reveals what the legend of the assassins conceals. Alamut's power did not come only from the fear that one of its agents might cross an enemy's threshold. It also came from its ability to preserve a world of meaning behind walls that armies had failed to break. Yet that sanctuary was becoming more fragile than anyone inside it may have understood. Beyond the eastern horizon, Mongol armies were transforming the political landscape of Asia, destroying cities, scattering courts, and forcing every surviving state to decide whether distance, negotiation, or submission could save it. Alamut had outlasted the Seljuks, endured theological upheaval, and turned a mountain stronghold into the center of a spiritual universe. But the power now moving toward Persia would not be satisfied by the old balance of siege, patience, and compromise. The Mongols did not arrive at Alamut as another dynasty seeking tribute, a neighboring prince hoping to seize a valley, or a tired army that might retreat when winter closed the mountain roads. They came from a world of conquest measured on a scale the Nizaris had never faced. Since the armies of Genghis Khan first entered the eastern Islamic lands in 1219, cities that had seemed permanent had been shattered, ruling families driven into exile, and old political boundaries erased beneath the movement of mounted armies. The Nizari fortresses survived those first waves partly because they were scattered, difficult to approach, and not always the most urgent targets. Their leaders negotiated when possible, offered submission when necessary, and searched for allies far beyond Persia, reportedly sending envoys westward in the hope that Christian rulers might recognize the danger advancing from Asia. Nothing substantial came from those appeals. Distance, conflicting interests, and Europe's limited understanding of the Mongols made coordinated resistance nearly impossible. Alamut had once benefited from the divisions of its enemies, but the Mongol advance was creating a new order in which isolated powers could no longer assume that geography would save them. By the middle of the 13th century, the Nizaris remained one of the few organized states in Persia not fully absorbed into Mongol authority. Their castles stood across Rudbar, Kumis, and Kohistan, connected by a tradition of survival that had endured for more than a century and a half. Yet those same castles now appeared to the Mongols as unfinished business. They controlled roads, sheltered armed communities, and represented an independent authority inside territory the conquerors intended to dominate completely. Münke Khan, the ruler of the expanding Mongol Empire, sent his brother Hulagu west with an enormous expedition. Later sources describe Hulagu's mission as including the destruction of the Nizari strongholds, the submission of resistant regional rulers, and eventually the conquest of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The exact limits of his original orders remain debated, partly because the historians who recorded them wrote from different political positions. But his actions left little doubt about his purpose. He was not coming to contain Alamut. He was coming to end the state built around it. Long before Hulagu reached the Alborz Mountains, Mongol commanders had already tested the eastern Nizari territories. Kihistan and Kumis experienced raids, sieges, and growing pressure, while Gertku entered a blockade that would outlast almost everyone who began it. The Nizaris still possessed formidable defenses, but they faced a military system capable of maintaining several campaigns at once. The Mongols could gather troops from conquered peoples, force local rulers to provide men and supplies, and replace losses on a scale no isolated fortress network could match. They were also skilled in siege warfare. The image of Mongol conquest as nothing more than fast-moving cavalry hides the engineers, stone-throwing machines, miners, and specialists drawn from across Asia who helped their armies reduce fortified cities. A mountain wall that had discouraged Seljuk commanders was not necessarily beyond Mongol reach. The Nizari leader at this moment was Ala al-Din Muhammad III, a ruler whose final years were clouded by internal tension, deteriorating relations with his son, and the growing certainty that a decisive invasion was approaching. In December 1255, he was murdered under circumstances that remain unclear. Some accounts blamed a close attendant, others suspected a larger conspiracy, and later writers shaped the event around accusations of instability inside the ruling household. His eldest son, Rukn al-Din Khurshah, succeeded him at roughly 25 years old. He inherited not a secure throne, but a narrowing circle of choices. Resisting might preserve honor and perhaps delay defeat, but it could expose entire fortress communities to destruction. Immediate surrender might save lives, yet the Mongols rarely allowed a defeated independent power to retain the very defenses that had made it dangerous. Khurshah chose negotiation, though whether this reflected caution, indecision, or a deliberate effort to gain time cannot be known with certainty. He sent representatives to Mongol commanders and offered submission, hoping to preserve at least the central Nizari communities. The Mongols replied that words were not enough. He would have to dismantle his fortifications order every garrison to surrender, and eventually present himself before Hulagu. Kursha delayed. He destroyed parts of some defenses while leaving others usable, sent envoys instead of appearing personally, and argued that distant commanders could not immediately obey. Each delay may have been an attempt to discover whether resistance elsewhere would distract the invaders, or whether winter would slow their advance. But Hulagu had come prepared for delay. In the spring of 1256, Mongol forces moved systematically through the Nizari territories, demanding the submission of local rulers and surrounding strongholds that refused. By autumn, several armies converged on Rudbar, closing the routes around the heart of the state. Kursha was no longer at Alamut. He had taken refuge at Maimundis, a newer fortress whose exact location remains debated, but which stood somewhere within the wider Alamut region. Maimundis lacked some of the natural advantages of the great ridge castles. Its defenses were strong, but its position allowed the Mongols to deploy siege engines with greater effect. On November 8, Hulagu established his camp opposite the fortress and renewed his demand for surrender. Negotiations continued while Mongol forces prepared their machines. Kursha's representatives asked for time, offered partial obedience, and claimed that he was not present even though he remained inside. Hulagu refused to accept anything short of complete submission. Stones began striking the defenses. Fighting continued for several days, and the arrival of winter made the decision more urgent for both sides. Kursha could still resist, but he had to consider what resistance would accomplish. Even if Maimundi survived for months, the Mongols were already attacking the rest of the network. No Seljuk succession crisis would suddenly pull them away. No neighboring ruler possessed the strength or desire to rescue Alamut. The strategic habits that had protected the Nizaris for generations no longer matched the enemy outside their walls. On November 19, 1256, Kursha descended from Maimundis with his vizier, leading officials, members of his household, and the scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. He presented himself before Hulagu and was initially received with calculated respect. The Nizari state had not yet been completely disarmed, and the Mongols still needed its imam alive. Kursha sent commands ordering the fortresses to surrender. Many obeyed. Around 40 strongholds reportedly opened their gates and were evacuated before Mongol forces demolished them. Their surrender was not simply the fall of stone positions. Each castle was the center of a small world containing homes, storerooms, workshops, administrative offices, places of worship, and memories accumulated across generations. People who had believed the walls would protect their children now watched those walls broken under the authority of their own leader. Some commanders refused. They may have doubted that Kursha was acting freely, believed continued resistance remained possible, or understood that surrender offered no reliable guarantee of survival. Alamut itself did not open immediately. The fortress that had stood at the center of Nizari history since 1090 held out until December, when its garrison finally submitted. Hulagu allowed the historian and government official Atamalik Juwaini to enter and inspect the castle before its destruction. Juwaini was no neutral witness. He served the Mongol administration and openly despised Nizari doctrine, but his account preserves a glimpse of what the conquerors found. He described impressive stores of food, sophisticated water facilities, manuscripts, records, and scientific instruments, the practical and intellectual foundations of a society that hostile legends had reduced to a nest of killers. Some valuable works, including texts connected to astronomy and other sciences, were selected for preservation. Many Nizari writings were condemned as heretical and destroyed. The exact scale and manner of the loss cannot be reconstructed, but the consequences were immense. A state can be conquered by seizing its fortresses. Its memory can be conquered by destroying the records through which it might have spoken for itself. Later historians would rebuild the story of Alamut, largely from accounts written by enemies, officials of the victorious Mongols, and fragments preserved by chance. The silence left in the library would shape the legend almost as powerfully as anything written within it. Kursha remained useful while castles continued to resist. Hulagu took him from the mountain region and kept him near the Mongol court, treating him with enough outward respect to encourage obedience from the remaining garrisons. But Lamassaw refused to surrender and continued resisting for roughly another year. Farther east, Girdku remained surrounded but unbroken. Kursha asked to travel to Mongolia and appeal directly to Mongka Khan, perhaps still hoping the supreme ruler would allow him to preserve some status or territory. He began the journey with an entourage, but Monk reportedly refused to receive him while important fortresses remained in resistance. On the return journey, Kursha and his companions were killed by their Mongol guards. Members of his family and many Nizari leaders were also put to death. Mongol forces carried out massacres against communities whose submission had not protected them, though the numbers and details in later chronicles vary and should not always be accepted literally. The intention, however, was clear. The conquerors wanted to prevent the political restoration of the Nizari state by removing the family and leadership around which resistance might gather. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi survived and entered Hulagu's service, eventually becoming one of the most influential scholars of the new Mongol order. Later traditions disagree over whether he had lived among the Nizaris as an honored scholar, a reluctant servant, or a captive seeking escape. His transition to Hulagu's court has therefore been interpreted both as pragmatic survival and as evidence of hostility toward his former patrons. The truth may have shifted over the many years he spent inside Nizari territory. Human loyalty under conquest is rarely as clean as later moral judgment demands. Alamut was demolished, but the campaign did not end in one winter. Lamassaw resisted until 1257, proving that Kursha's surrender had not instantly dissolved every local decision. Girdku endured even longer. Its siege had begun in 1253, and the garrison continued holding out through hunger, isolation, disease, and the destruction of the state to which it had belonged. It finally surrendered in December 1270, reportedly because its defenders lacked adequate clothing after 17 years under siege. The endurance of Girdku exposes the simplicity of saying that the assassins vanished when Alamut fell. Their central government ended in 1256, but resistance survived in separate fortresses, and Nizari communities continued living in Persia beneath new forms of concealment. The Mongols had defeated what earlier empires could only contain because they combined overwhelming resources with a refusal to tolerate independent fortified power. They did not wait for Alamut to become harmless. They dismantled the network, removed its leadership, scattered its people, and destroyed much of its written memory. Yet even that violence could not erase the community entirely. Somewhere beyond the roads watched by Mongol soldiers, followers preserved the belief that the line of imams had survived. Traditions later held that one of Kursha's young sons had been taken to safety before the final surrender, escaping the fate of much of his family. The details are difficult to confirm, but evidence of continued Ismaili activity after the conquest shows that the fall of the fortress was not the extinction of the faith. Alamut had ceased to be the center of a state, but the idea it had protected for 166 years moved once again into hidden houses, distant villages, and the memory of scattered believers. The Mongols had broken the eagle's nest, yet they had not killed everything that had learned to fly from it. When the smoke cleared over the broken walls of Alamut, the world assumed the story had ended. The Mongols had destroyed the political center of the Nizari state, killed much of its leadership, scattered its communities, and reduced fortresses that had resisted empires for generations to ruins exposed beneath the mountain sky. To the chroniclers of the victors, This looked like a complete conclusion. The rebels had been defeated, their castles opened, their books condemned, and their ruler removed. Yet states and communities do not always die at the same moment. A government can disappear in a season while the people who believed in it survive for centuries, carrying fragments of identity through villages, families, private rituals, and stories no conquering army can fully detect. This was what happened after Alamut. The Nizari Ismailis lost their visible state, but they did not lose the faith that had created it. Many communities returned to concealment, living quietly under Mongol and later Muslim rulers, sometimes presenting themselves publicly in forms that attracted less suspicion. In a world where belonging to the wrong religious group could invite punishment, secrecy was not evidence of an endless conspiracy. It was often a practical method of survival. The mountain fortresses had once protected the community from the outside. Now protection depended upon becoming less visible within the outside world. The fate of the imamate became central to that survival. Rukn al-Din Khusha, the last ruler of the Alamut state, had been killed along with many members of his family, and hostile chroniclers believed the Nizari line had been extinguished. Nizari tradition, however, maintained that a young son survived and was carried to safety before the destruction was complete. Later generations identified the continuing imam as Shams al-Din Muhammad, though the details of his early life remain difficult to reconstruct from contemporary evidence. This uncertainty is not surprising. A lineage hiding from a government determined to eliminate it would leave few public records, and many surviving accounts were written long afterward. What can be observed more securely is that organized Nizari communities continued to exist after 1256 and later recognized a continuing line of imams. The survival of those communities makes complete extinction unlikely, even if the precise route by which leadership passed through the first post-Alamut generations remains partly hidden. In Persia, followers adapted to local conditions and sometimes became associated with Sufi language and institutions, which offered concepts and forms familiar enough to conceal specifically Ismaili loyalties. The imam could be described through the imagery of a spiritual guide, while Nizari teachings circulated in poetry, symbolism, and carefully protected oral tradition. This was not simply the abandonment of an older identity. It was the reshaping of that identity so it could pass through a dangerous age. Religious communities often survive not because they preserve every outward form unchanged, but because they recognize which parts can bend without breaking the meaning at the center. The political world around them changed repeatedly. Mongol rule fragmented, new dynasties rose, and rival powers struggled across Iran and Central Asia. Each change created fresh danger, but also moments when the attention of rulers moved elsewhere. By the 15th century, the Nizari imams were associated with Anjudan in central Persia, where the community entered a period of renewed organization and literary activity. Missionaries reconnected scattered followers across Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, Syria, and the Indian subcontinent. New works were produced, older teachings were preserved, and communities that had spent generations separated by distance began to recover a stronger sense of belonging to the same tradition. This renewal did not restore the state of Alamut, nor did it attempt to rebuild an empire of mountain castles. The strategy had changed completely. Authority now traveled through relationships and religious networks rather than fortified territory. Alamut had demonstrated how belief could become a state. The centuries after Alamut demonstrated how belief could survive without one. The Syrian Nizaris followed a different but equally revealing path. Their strongholds had escaped Hulagu's destruction, but their independence could not last forever. In the second half of the 13th century, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars expanded his control across Syria and systematically reduced the autonomy of local powers. The Nizari castles submitted one after another during the 1260s and 1270s. Some communities remained in their traditional districts, but their leaders no longer commanded an independent mountain state. Masyaf, once the center from which Sinan had negotiated with Saladin and the Crusaders, became part of a larger political order. The Syrian Nizaris survived as a religious minority, sometimes facing persecution and sometimes reaching practical arrangements with neighboring authorities. Their continued presence reveals the same pattern seen in Persia. The destruction of political independence did not produce the disappearance imagined by hostile historians. The people called assassins did not vanish. They became less useful to the chronicles of kings because they no longer controlled castles or altered royal successions. But history continues even when court writers stop looking. While the real communities adjusted to life after defeat, Europe preserved a very different version of them. The word that became assassin passed through medieval French and Italian forms, derived from names used for the Syrian Nizaris. Over time, its connection to one specific religious group weakened. It came to mean a person who deliberately killed a politically important figure, and eventually any hired or secret murderer. This linguistic transformation was powerful because it placed the medieval Nizaris inside ordinary speech. Every time the word was used, a distant echo of the old accusations survived, even after speakers had forgotten Alamut, Sinan, or the Crusades. Language performed a conquest more complete than the Mongols had achieved. The community endured, but its enemy's name for it became universal. European travel literature deepened the transformation. Stories about the old man of the mountain, drugged followers, hidden gardens, and unquestioning obedience were copied from one author to another. Each repetition made the details seem more established, although few writers possessed direct knowledge of Nizari life. The legend satisfied several European desires at once. It offered an exotic East filled with secret pleasures and terrifying rulers. It explained political violence through manipulation rather than conviction. It allowed readers to imagine a hidden organization operating beyond ordinary law while remaining disciplined enough to reach kings. Most importantly, it turned uncertainty into a complete story. Real history left unresolved questions. Why did particular individuals accept dangerous missions? How much authority did Alamut exercise over distant communities? Who commissioned certain attacks? And what exactly happened inside ceremonies whose own records were later destroyed? Legend removed every ambiguity. Hashish explained courage, the garden explained loyalty, and the old man explained command. The story survived because it was simpler than the truth and more vivid than evidence. During the 19th century, European scholars began studying the Ismailis with greater seriousness, but many still worked from hostile medieval chronicles and inherited assumptions. The Nizaris were frequently presented as a fanatical sect outside the normal history of Islam, as though their intellectual traditions, social organization, and changing political strategies mattered less than the killings attributed to them. Only with the recovery and study of Ismaili manuscripts did a fuller picture begin to emerge. Scholars found theological works, philosophical writings, devotional poetry, and historical traditions revealing communities far more complex than the caricature of drugged murderers. The correction did not erase the violence associated with the Nizari states. Their leaders did authorize targeted political killings, and those actions caused real fear and suffering. Historical revision becomes misleading if it replaces one myth with another and turns a threatened minority into innocent victims incapable of calculated force. The deeper truth is less comfortable. The Nizaris were both a persecuted community and political actors capable of violence. They preserved knowledge and used terror. They negotiated peace while preparing for danger. They survived stronger enemies partly because they understood that fear could compensate for limited numbers. Complexity does not excuse their actions, but it prevents those actions from becoming the only part of their identity. Modern novels, films, and games have given the assassins another life, often imagining them as an ancient brotherhood defending freedom against equally secret enemies. These fictional orders borrow names, fortresses, clothing, and fragments of medieval history, then combine them with ideas created centuries later. They have introduced millions of people to Alamut, while also moving the popular image even farther from the historical Nizari Ismailis. That does not make the fiction worthless. Legends reveal what later societies want the past to contain. The assassins have become symbols of resistance, fanaticism, hidden knowledge, disciplined violence, and the fear that unseen individuals may influence events more than armies do. Each age has rebuilt them according to its own anxieties. Medieval courts imagined infiltrators behind palace walls. European travelers imagined enslaved minds inside false paradises. Modern audiences imagine secret organizations directing history from the shadows. Beneath every version remains the same fascination: the possibility that a small, hidden group could terrify powers far greater than itself. Yet the most remarkable legacy of Alamut may be the one least suited to legend. The Nizari Ismaili community survived. Its followers continued across Persia, Syria, Central Asia, South Asia, and eventually many other parts of the world, recognizing a living line of imams and developing institutions far removed from the military conditions of the medieval fortress state. The community associated in popular memory with secrecy and killing became known in later centuries for education, philanthropy, development, and intellectual engagement. This transformation did not erase its medieval past, but it proves that no community is permanently imprisoned inside the role assigned to it by its enemies. Alamut itself became a ruin, repeatedly damaged by conquest, earthquakes, weather, and later treasure hunters searching for evidence of the stories they had inherited. Archaeology has revealed defensive walls, chambers, water systems, and the practical foundations of life on the mountain, but no evidence of the enchanted paradise described by Marco Polo. The physical remains point toward labor rather than magic: stone carried upward, water controlled, food stored, and human beings building a place where they believed their community might endure. That reality is less extravagant than the legend, yet it is more impressive. A false garden requires only imagination. A functioning society on an isolated ridge requires generations of planning, sacrifice, and adaptation. The assassins terrified medieval rulers, but not because they possessed supernatural control over human minds. They understood the weaknesses of political systems built around powerful individuals, used geography to turn small numbers into resistance, and allowed uncertainty to multiply the effect of every action. Their enemies then magnified that power by repeating stories they could not prove. In the end, the Mongols destroyed the state, but the believers survived. The library was broken, but fragments of thought endured. The fortresses fell, but the hostile name entered languages across the world. Alamut died as a political center in 1256, yet the legend born around it continued growing because history had lost too many of its own witnesses. Perhaps that is the final secret of the assassins. They were never as powerful as frightened rulers imagined, never as simple as hostile chroniclers claimed, and never truly erased by the empire that brought down their walls. The eagle's nest became silent, but the story escaped the mountain, and once it entered the imagination of the world, no army could surround it again. Alamut fell. But its legend survived, carried across centuries by fear, faith, and mystery. Thank you for listening to Sleepy Hidden History. Please subscribe to the channel and sleep